Your Worship, when you're ready, I'll introduce Ms. Sinclair, although she needs no introduction.
All right, thank you. So I'll bring this special meeting for the budget purposes to order. And the first item is the adoption and receipt of the agenda items. Could I have a motion, please? Councillor Ferguson, second by Councillor Arneson. Any additions? All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. And we now go to presentations, continuing with the 2020 draft budget presentation. And I'll turn it over to Mr. Backen to introduce Ms. Sinclair, who, as he said, needs no introduction.
Thank you, Your Worship. The state we're at right now as we continue with this budget journey. Again, more incoming information, more information going back out to members of council. So we've had a good exchange of information going forward. Today, Karen will try to pick up, I guess, with some of the items that were flagged, referred, or mentioned, or referenced. So we'll pick up that. We'll pick up on some of the background information as part of that. On table, I think, is some additional information as we continue to work. And more importantly, we also have one of the slides early on that kind of sets the next steps. We're not certain we quite have the next steps yet, however, because we have to see how the discussion goes. So at most, I think what we would be looking for today would be another matter to have either schedule another meeting to consider the budget further, or perhaps take us to public consultation or something in between that's a hybrid of what council's thinking about. But that's our intended journey for today as we continue trying to I guess, elaborate upon some of the information you have, explain it, and clarify it.
Thank you. Councillor Richter has a question.
We could vary the agenda slightly and go through Councillor Woodward's submission to council, because I'm quite intrigued with the 2.98% proposed increase, and I'd like to know more about.
So the presentation is it's basically one item on the agenda, and so Ms. Sinclair, I don't know how you want to roll. Perhaps I'll ask Ms. Sinclair what your intention was to roll out some of the input that you've received from members of council. And
so, Your Worship, just while we're getting her mic on, that's a very good question. We actually thought about that, and in fact, we've actually adjusted the presentation so that the first item referred, referenced, or considered is the proposal that was referenced. So I think it starts on the third or the fourth slide. So it's very, we're into it very early.
Okay, then that should be sufficient. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Sinclair. And I know before we get going, I want to thank you and staff again. I know you've been working a lot of overtime to get to this point today, and we do appreciate it. Thank you. So I'll turn it over to you.
Your Worship, members of council, here we go with some additional information. Some of it is bringing back original information, bringing back flagged items for capital so that we can touch upon them that were distributed in the Q&A the last time. And then also looking at the memo that you all received over the weekend. And that's probably where we'll start. So this is the schedule still today as it stands. We may have to revisit this at the end of today and see how we do with it. But that's how it stands right now. We've got the open houses scheduled for the 18th and 19th. And as I say, we'll revisit that after this. So this is items flagged just in general. And the first item that we have is a proposal for the 2020 property tax increase of 2.98%, as Councillor Richter alluded to. So I'll start with that. And maybe Councillor Woodward can jump in anytime, and if I'm not saying something that rings true. So on January 20th, the top half of this slide represents where we were with the different elements of the budget. So I've broken it into 6 parts. We had what was called the base budget, which the newspaper referred to as a turn the lights on, because we referred to it as that, for 4.12%. And then we had programs and large contract increases at 3.6 million or 2.27%. We had additions to the infrastructure, that is additions to the money that we budget for in the operating plan, so it does impact taxes, that we send over to the capital program. So we have a base budget of 8.9 million, and there was some additional requests that totaled 1.8 million this year to take that number up. So that's the 1.35%. Under asset maintenance is 2 items. One of them is an increase to paving of 500,000, road paving, and that is purely in the operating budget. That's just an increased level of paving. And the other one is to start to reestablish the capital infrastructure renewal and replacement reserve with a $500,000 transfer to that reserve included in this top part. Protective Services has 4 officers starting October 1st that would need to be annualized in the following year. And then there was a list of other projects and programs that totaled 736,000 positions and programs for 0.55%. So that's where we started on January 20th. On February 3rd, we had a few small changes. Well, we had a few small changes and then one large change. To the base budget, we found a few items that we could eliminate. So we brought the 4.12 down to 3.86, and the biggest piece of that was by sending the property taxes on the land assembly, taking it out of the operating budget and sending it over to one times, because we will only have to pay it one time, and after that we will be exempt. So that has moved out of the operating budget and into one times. The second item was the larger change, where this one you can see above was 3.6 million. Engineering took that back and they worked on those increases. There's target levels that they have for each of the programs and contracts that they budget for, and what this did is just takes a little bit longer to get to their target. So rather than have the 3.6 million all in 2020, they have spread it out largely over the first 2 years, and then it carries on over the final 3 years. And I'll have a slide that will show you the impact on the future years as we move through. Infrastructure, the rest of the other 4 items have not changed, so you'll see they're all the same as above. So that's kind of our starting point from the township budget perspective. And then we move. So take note of that the structure of this. So I've put the memo that came out on the weekend from Councillor Woodward, and this is the same information in his format. So he's got a base budget of starting point of 4.12%. My understanding is he wanted to start where we all started. The programs and large contract increases, he's recognizing the work that engineering did, so he has 1.27%. Infrastructure, and I'll have slides for each of these. Infrastructure, 475,000, and asset maintenance, 325. If you add those together, that's the 800,000 that is mentioned in his memo. And then protective services, I'll have a slide on that one where I'll get into some more detail. That's the one hiring 10 police officers October 1st. And then the last item we'll probably spend a significant amount of time on it is the other discretionary requests, one of which is the roads DCCs coming into the operating budget. So just in a format that everybody has seen, these are the different categories. This is a reminder to what went into the 4.12% and staff's 3.86%. You can see the salaries at 2.167%. Then there's annualizations and deferments, and Rcmp annualizations is that next section. And then a number of items as we list down, including external debt payments, second from the bottom, offset by the decrease in the transfer to the capital infrastructure renewal reserve. And that list gets us down to the 5505 where we started. All right, and this is the change in the programs. So this one has a slide on the bottom part that shows you the impact over the future years. That was one of the common questions I had is what will this reduction in 2020 do to the following years? So there you have it. The first line is how the budget came in initially with 3.6 million in 2020. 544, 359, 289, and 249, and you can see what engineering has done in terms of spreading it out over the 5-year period. So it's the same projects, the same money, and it's just taking longer to get to their goals. That's all. All right. So it definitely will have an impact on year 2, and a smaller impact on years 3, 4, and 5. Okay, this is getting into some of the meat of Councillor Woodward's plan, and it shows on the right-hand column, the stars are showing the items that changed from the original plan that you received. And you can see the 475 on the bottom of the top slide and the 325 in the bottom of the bottom slide come together to form that 800,000 that you see in the memo. So I'll tread more slowly through this section, so give you a chance to catch up in case you're following through the memo. The bottom right corner of these two sections, the 475,000 and on the top part, and I can use the mouse, this 475 right here, and then this 325 right here. Yeah. So this is what's referred to as infrastructure and asset maintenance. So some of the contribution to capitals have been reduced. Our parks has stayed the same. And then there's been a couple of removals of contribution to capital funding from the existing budget, the 8.9 million that I alluded to down below to help help to make that point.
Right.
And then on the bottom part, the 500 from the Capital Infrastructure Renewal and Replacement Reserve transfer is down to 325, and the road paving is taking a year off from having an increase this year. So that's the other 325.
So maybe just stop, ask some questions, and maybe staff can help with this. I'm just concerned about the reducing the road capital facilities and storm, especially after what we just saw in the last few weeks, those heavy rains and all the work that has to be done. And the roads, the potholes from the winter, they're really taking a hit. And I know we had a program that we instituted years ago to add 500, and now we're reducing it, and I'm concerned what may happen in the future. Has engineering actually looked at is this going to set us back? I mean, sometimes we have to bite the bullet to maintain our infrastructure, and by cutting back now, how's that going to impact us in the future? Because we have a lot of roads, storm sewers, and everything else to maintain.
On the issue of the road paving, I did ask the engineering department over the weekend to provide a response, thinking that might come up today, and this is the response. So we're currently at $2.7 million in the base budget for the road paving program, and if they add $500,000 per year, then they're about 2.5 years away from their goal, which is the $4.5 million, which is their target. And it's based on the work comes out of their pavement management system is what determines what has to be done. So they're just trying to catch up, and then they'll stay on track at that point moving forward. So I'll just settle here for a second for those who want to take a read of this.
Yeah, I've got a list here. I just want everybody to get a chance to read this. And then,
I specifically received this question, so I thought
okay. Yeah.
It doesn't say anything about the amount of money.
Okay. Councillor Woodward.
Yes, Wayne, can you go back to slide 9, please? Yeah, so here the infrastructure and asset maintenance at these numbers. Now, in the proposal at the 800,000, within the 4.12 starting point, the additions to contributions to capital and road paving were at 0. Like those were not included in the 4.12.
They were in the base coming forward. So the 4.12 represented an increase in this year's budget over last year, but the 8.9 was in the base budget, so not in the 4.12. And so, are you referring to the 400 and the 200?
I'm referring to the additional 1.8.
Oh, the additional 1.8 was not in the 4.12.
Right.
Correct.
So
yeah.
the proposal that I submitted increased the numbers from the 4.12.
Correct.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Councillor Richter.
Yeah, so basically we've got 2.7 million in this year's budget for paving. That's correct?
Base
Okay.
budget, yeah.
And this being a very exceptional and unusual budget year because of all the pressures that we're facing. Leaving it at 2.7 million shouldn't be that problematic for 1 year, should it?
I will defer to Mr. Zweig. Mr. Zweig?
Mr. Zweig.
Did you want to add anything, Roland?
Thank you. Through the worship to Councillor Richter. The data suggests that if we're not coming up to acceptable levels for the paving program, it basically defers future costs when the deterioration conditions become worse. So staff anticipate doing a full condition assessment of all the arterial roads and collector roads in 2020, and then presenting that back to council towards the end of the year with desired funding levels.
I thought we already had one of those done back in 2015.
I believe you did in 2015, correct? And you're
That's
redoing?
correct. It's a reoccurring analysis. It has to be done every 5 to 6 years. So it's just time to do another assessment in 2020.
Okay, but we could push it off for 1 year. If it's 5 to 6 years, it could wait till 2021, right?
Yeah, our goal here is just to provide all the information, and absolutely council can make that decision for sure.
Yeah. I mean, the issue here from my perspective is we just simply can't do everything for everyone, not this year. So we do have to make some tough decisions. And having 2.7 million in there already for paving should be enough for this year, in my opinion.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Ferguson?
Well, yeah, paving is always a challenge, and I'm a layman. I'll use the layman's, and the staff might be able to correct me or help me. Is I was on the impression when you have a road and you have a pothole or a crack begins, it's best to get it early, and it's cheaper to use some either gravel or one of those heated patches things and get it early, rather than if you leave it and the hole keeps getting bigger and bigger and the road starts deteriorating, and from what I understand you have to replace the whole section of the road, which is far more expensive. Is that correct, if made through a chair?
That is correct.
And that's why it's important that that's what years ago when we talked about the contribution to capital and major roads was always important to keep our roads. We've got a lot of roads in the community, and to keep them up as best we can. Thank you.
Thanks. Councillor Davis?
Thank you. Can you just clarify, 2.7 million, does that include what Mayor Froese said? Does that include the 500,000? We put 500,000 a year in, and how long did that plan go for?
It didn't receive the whole 500,000 every single year. It went down to 375 one year, and then in a couple of years it was a tiny bit higher because we were trying to squeeze a little bit extra in there. But it's been going on since 2014.
And it's indefinite, right? Every year it comes up in the budget?
They're working to a goal of 4.5 million.
But 4.5 million, once we get that, all that's going to do is give us a couple of years off if we need 2.7. We have an awful lot of roads, and there's a lot. When I drive the roads, I never phone, oh, there's a pothole. Well, I did the other day because somebody else. But roads, sewer, water, our roads do need uptake. So I'm just worried we don't want to, if that's going to be one thing we're going to respect. But as proven, we have taken some out, but we put back. But I would I don't know if I voted for that in 2015 or not, but I think that roads are somewhere, but you can see if we take out some money, it's just going to be in the end because we got an awful lot of roads, and some of our roads don't. I know it'd be a good idea to have that assessment. That's the first thing we need, and that assessment might boggle our minds. It might be worse than what we think it is. Anyhow, okay, I'm sorry, it's just a question. I wanted to know if that was 500 in there. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Whitmarsh?
Yeah, just on this one, so just so I understand, the 4.5 million was identified in 2015 on what it would take for us to keep up with our paving and repair paving of our roads in the township.
Correct.
So based on just coal increases, that number is probably closer to 5 million today at about roughly 2.5% annual increase in cost of living and expenses. So we're really just barely above half of what we need. Is that correct?
I'm just going to confirm with Mr. Zweig. I believe it might have started at 4 back in 2015. Does that ring a bell, or from your recollection, has it always been 4.5? Just speaking to the COLA increases, I feel like it started a little bit lower.
Thank you, to your worship. There's definitely two numbers that have been going around. The 4.5 was identified in the 2015 assessment and report to council. What's important to note, and maybe just for added clarification, every year that the program is funded not sufficiently will further likely deteriorate the overall road condition of our road, i.e. increasing the funding gap and condition levels. So that's why this year's exercise will be a good opportunity to provide an update to Mayor and Council.
Thank you.
Okay. So in addition to within the last 5 years, and I guess this is coming in a report later on roads, but we not only do we have the same roads from 2015, but we've added roads.
Right.
So not only is there a cost of living increase or cost increases of inflation, but there's also additional roads. So it seems like we're falling further and further behind, even at the 500,000 per year. It feels like we're falling behind, actually. So to have a year off with nothing does seem to be a bit of an issue for me, at least. Thank you.
Thanks.
We were trying to, at one point in time, to do a 0.5% tax increase. Instead of an even 500,000, a couple of years we were able to do that, which would at least then keep up with what that increase was. But we fell back in a tough year. We fell back to the 500 again. So that could maybe be part of that assessment that's done, is to build that COLA into it, so that it's not stuck at the $500,000 amount.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Long?
Your Worship, I'll comment on this because the slide is here, but I'd like to talk or speak to this whole process that we're going through. But let's go by the slide, because am I reading something different than perhaps some of the councillors on that side of the table? Because it's very clear that it says that we need 4.5 million. So how can we say that 2.7 has got to be more than enough? Maybe many on council, unlike me, maybe they're getting calls from the public saying, hey, our roads are great, please don't fix them. But I get the opposite, and this has been a bad winter, and every winter's bad, actually. So I can't understand how we could be even discussing a possibility that underfunding this program, which we undertook in 2015, is a good thing to do. It can't be. It's impossible. You're not even, like it was mentioned, you're probably about halfway there when you take a COLA. But I mean, it's not so much COLA, but as has been mentioned, as the roads are ignored, they get worse, which means it's more expensive to fix. So that just is a non-starter for me, and I don't understand where the rest of council is coming from in saying, well, 2.7 ought to be enough. So now I'd like to comment on the process. It looks like we're analyzing Councillor Woodward's proposal. Is that on the table? Has that been moved? Has that been something that council's doing, or that's just the way? Because I could have sent a memo too, only I didn't.
So thanks for that. And Ms. Sinclair can help me out if I'm on the process. But, you know, at the last budget meeting, it was asked of council if they wanted to submit any ideas, and all of council had that opportunity. And so Ms. Sinclair has incorporated those ideas in here just for discussion. We're not making any motions at this point. This is all for discussion, and I know Councillor Long had some input too. So that'll be worked through. At the end of this meeting, I believe we're just going to be looking for a motion to move this to the public, and all of these ideas can be moved to the public. I don't believe we need motions today to add or subtract. Is that correct? It's more, let's have a discussion. Information came forward. You know, this is a good discussion because we have to see where council is coming from and to go over these ideas. But at the end of the day, at the end of today's meeting, we'll be seeking a motion to move to the public, get some public input, then come back, and then we'll do the heavy lifting and do the amendments. Is that fair to say, Mr. Backen? I think it's based on a discussion.
Thank you. That's
okay,
good.
Thanks.
Clarifies.
I'm going to move quickly to the next speaker, but I have one clarification question on slide 9. The 800 that's hanging out there by itself, I don't understand. What's that relating to? I'm trying
It's just trying to tie these two charts, which we used in our original presentation to council, to tie them into the memo from Councillor
okay.
Woodward. He had mentioned an amount of 800,000, and that's what makes it up.
Okay, thanks. Thanks. Councillor Arneson?
Yes, thank you, Worship. I just want to clarify, so we're talking about sort of skipping forward to what we're going to do with this discussion at the end of the day. I just want to clarify through our process that there could be some consideration. Of course, council would have to agree to break out some of these components, perhaps, so that it could be more clear once we put our budget forward in terms of public engagement, so people will have a better idea what some of the components are, because there are some that I would be agreeable to, but through discussion today, I know I want to put forward as a must-have, but I wish that the public could have that opportunity to consider that as a portion of the budget. So, thanks.
Thanks. Councillor Richter?
Yeah, so the 500,000 that we're putting in 2020, how much of that is for this updated study?
That would be, the 500 is for capital. I don't know if the study would come out of capital. Mrs. Wag, with the study that you're planning to do, is that out of your operational budget that you already have? Yeah, it's not out of capital. The 500 is for capital, for pavement improvements and replacement.
Correct, for actual, asphalt.
Study.
Do you have an idea, Mr. Swag?
Thank you, Your Worship. I do not believe we've gone out to tender or RFP on this one, but typically it's either between $50,000 and $100,000 to do the assessment.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Woodward?
Yeah, I'd like to clarify the process too, because this is pretty thick. We may not actually get through this in time as well, but I fully intend to move the amendment to the budget. I don't want to send 7.5% to the public when I don't think there's any chance that the council is going to adopt 7.5%. So I think I'm going to question that right up front here, that just sending everything to public consultation really is not the process that I've seen in the past. We've sort of sent the draft budget that we intend on moving forward with, not 20 million different options. But that would give Councillor Long some additional time to come up with that memo that he's apparently contemplating. Thanks.
Okay, we'll keep this to the issues, not directed at people. All ideas are good. Okay, so it looks like that exhausts the questions for this slide. We can move forward. Thank you.
Okay, protective services. So in the original plan, we had 4 police officers starting October the 1st. And that's the 175 that you see there on that first line to the left. And that's an October 1st start. The total for the 4 officers for a full year was 700,000. So the difference would be annualized in year 2 using that program. What is being, and please, Councillor Woodward, feel free to jump in here, but what is being proposed here is to take a 5-6 year look at our needs as it relates to protective services, because Superintendent Power has mentioned that his cop-to-pop ratio is kind of too high right now, and he's mentioning that he needs somewhere between 10 and 15 officers to bring it back into sync. So I have a slide with some numbers to address that, but before I get to that slide, which is very cluttered, I just wanted to explain that what Councillor Woodward has done here is he's provided an envelope of $750,000. And that $750,000 in the right-hand column is broken down between the first item, which is 10 police officers starting October 1st. And then the number right below it is 311 would be a transfer to the Rcmp Reserve. And the reason for that is seeding of the reserve is the Rcmp Reserve has just under $5 million in it. And by adding this in, we add another 311 in it. The idea is that because of the front load need for hiring 10 officers right away, if we use the reserve to smooth out some of the peaks and valleys over the 5-year period, we can keep the percentage increase in check. If we accept that the envelope for protective services is $750 each year in the budget, just going up by the inflation, which for police right now is 2.5%. So if we accept that that's a relatively similar amount that we will add each year to hire police for this 5-year period, by the end of the 5-year period, we will have the cop-to-pop ratio in line, which will be under the 900 that is a target for the Superintendent Power. And then at that point in time, we will have front-loaded with those officers that we require. We will now be in a position where we probably only need maybe 1 every couple of years. And it will be based on, as population grows, of course, that would be synced moving on. And we try not to get to the point where we need to hire 10 to bring us up to speed. So that's the idea, is using the power of the reserve that exists to help take the pressure off the operating budget by using it in those years, in those first few years where the cost is going to be high. So we would bring enough money in from the reserve in year 2 to make sure that the annualization of those 10 officers doesn't go over 750 plus inflation. Does that make sense? It's not an easy thing to describe.
2 questions. The RCP Reserve, so is that the capital reserve that exists for the building?
Yes.
Is that what we're talking about?
Correct.
So have we been adding to that reserve annually?
Yes.
And so now you're suggesting that money from the capital reserve be transferred into operational to hire officers.
Yeah. So in the memo, I think it also mentions the conversion of the name away from it being just a capital reserve, but being just an RCMP reserve, and maybe potentially having 2 sections, 1 operating and 1 capital. But that was also part of the memo, was to make it more available for that type of a strategy over 5 years.
How healthy is the reserve for anticipated needs of the RCP building?
It has it has been experiencing about a $1.5 million transfer per year based on the surplus, and the surplus is the difference between the authorized strength and the actual strength. So it has been about $1.5 million a year, give or take a couple $100,000 each year. So it's at $4.5 million this year after what we're going to take out of it this year.
Thank you, Councillor Richter.
Yeah, a couple of questions. I really like the idea of adding 10 police officers. I think that the public has been quite clear in their concern around property crime issues, dealing with homelessness and so on. But if it was a perfect world and we could put out the call and get the 10 officers this year, would we have the money to hire the 10 officers this year using this mechanism?
Well, based on the fact that we're rarely in the last little while have we been equal to our authorized strength, so we're usually below. I think the issue for Superintendent Power is that he has to get those requests in the pipeline with Ottawa. So it's sort of this is sort of a little bit like overfilling the plane. Is the analogy we used. In that we're using the $750,000 envelope to give some predictability for the budget for the next 5 years. We're going to hire officers knowing that we can't necessarily determine when they'll get here, but in a perfect world, they'd get here October 1st. And
have enough money to have them all on board.
Yes,
okay. Now, second question, I still don't understand why we need a senior bylaw officer. Why wouldn't we just, instead of having 1 senior and 2 junior, why wouldn't we just have 3 junior?
That I do not know. Is there anybody that can speak to the senior bylaw officer?
I believe it would be more towards the operational side. So the more junior officers you have, you would need those senior officers to deal with the day-to-day operations of those officers that are there.
But we don't have that many bylaw officers right now, so I'm not understanding why we need a senior guy or person.
Let's see what I have here.
Like, why can't they be a self-managing team, as an example?
So are we, don't think that exists. I'm just wondering if is it more the, what do you call them? The officers that are starting would be starting basically as new, just being trained, not existing from other, and you'd be looking for either promoting one of our existing officers and replacing with a new one, so we still get 3, but there's still that requirement for that supervisory position, which is a higher wage, by adding personnel, and that's okay. Thanks.
The write-up says this senior bylaw enforcement officer processes bylaw enforcement files and complaints and provides day-to-day field supervision and oversight to bylaw enforcement officers and parking bylaw enforcement officers.
Okay, so a senior bylaw officer, is that an exempt position or is it a union position?
Union?
It's union. Okay, so if it's a union position, I still don't understand why we're setting up this managerial hierarchy and not looking at something more innovative like a self-managing team where they all take responsibility. And that could be done within a unionized framework.
Okay. I think Mr. Backen can take that back for some consideration, but as it presently stands, under the contract, I'm assuming that there needs to be a certain level of supervision. Is that correct, Mr. Backen?
That's correct, Your Worship. I think the question is actually geared toward the number of bylaw officers, the number of supervisory and managers that are in place, and then the process by which they advance. So we can actually go and determine, I guess, those numbers or review those numbers and then come with the implications under the collective agreement, because I believe this was effectively more of a lead hand role is what they were thinking of. And we'll have to see if the definitions of the collective agreement allow us that flexibility. They might. It's a good suggestion, so we'll come back to that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Councillor Woodward.
I just want to clarify, you can go back to slide 11 for me. So I think this is a pretty important one to have council really think about here. So the more I started asking about that and reviewing with Mr. Backen and yourself, the Rcmp building reserve, when it was being funded by people being taxed for, this is round numbers, right? 150 officers. We get 140. And that additional, 175 times 10 goes into the reserve, right? So make sure everybody understands that this is being funded by property tax for RCMP officers that we're not getting.
Correct.
Would that be fair? So
Yes.
just be given the logistics of it and everything else. And so this proposal with a relatively healthy reserve and no pending demands on this building, in the millions of dollars, it seemed possible that you and I discussed how this works. We could build into the base budget $700,000 this year. Still unclear, what the annualization of these additional offers will actually cost next year. We're going to get more into that reserve because the authorized strength that we're taxing people will not catch up in 1 year. So that reserve would be replenished. And then we could even look at not exactly what you proposed or outlined. Rather than another 700 or 900 next year, we could do 400 next year, add that into the base budget, and then do 400 in 2022 and add 400 per year, sort of drawing down that reserve kind of where it is. It'll even be healthier than where it is today with those additional contributions going back in.
Yep.
Yep.
We just have to remember, that is true, we just have to remember that for the number of officers that we do hire, that they would be a permanent addition once they're here, ongoing. So we just have to
So the proposal is that we can, given some of this issue and some of these tax dollars that have been collected for RCMP we didn't actually receive, we can smooth out that addition to protective services over, say, 3 years with, in the range of 0.4% or 0.5%.
Correct.
For a significant addition in capacity.
Yep.
Sort of strategically using that healthy reserve
Yes.
for RCMP.
Correct.
Great, thank you.
And then over time, paying back into it so it comes back to
Yep.
where it is.
That's right.
Councillor Ferguson?
Okay, yeah, I think, first of all, clarification on the building reserve. Is that building reserve for personnel or building reserve for actual bricks and mortars?
I think the reserve is just for bricks and mortars over time, if it needed major renovations or to be replaced at some point in time in the future. I think it was just a building towards that.
Because the more I talk to the RCMPs, they seem to think that there's a need for expansion of their, I guess, buildings or infrastructure or something like that. Is that correct? I know the officer, Mr. Inspector Power's not here today, but is that the case?
It depends whether you're talking about the detachment or the CPO structure.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't, other than building a new detachment, that'd be expensive.
Yeah.
Or else putting something somewhere else. I'm not sure, what they've advised you. We always talk about 5 and 10 year budgets and terms and financials. I'm not sure what their particular program is, particularly with Surrey and the state they're in.
Well, it definitely makes sense as you add officers, and especially if we're going to add 10, that we'll get there faster to the point where we would need to expand, presumably.
But you don't know when
I don't
they're
know.
next.
I'm sorry.
Because that you can maybe get
I can
him to answer that.
Yeah.
And another one is, because the more you look at that, 5 million doesn't look like that much. And if you want to build another building, you need more than that. And I don't know how helpful Ottawa is anymore. Now, regarding our 4 versus 10 officers, it could be 10 or 20 officers. We could always have more police. I'm looking at this table. I probably have had more property crime than most of my colleagues, if not as much. And basically, the city has not, in their proposal, they have not asked for any new officers over the next 5 years. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So here we are.
Yeah.
In the township, a growing community. The city is beside us. We had the mayor and a bunch of mayors at a function last week, and the most vocal mayor, with the mayor of the city, God bless her, said their community is growing. They're open for business. They're putting more and more and more units in. They've gotten rid of all their crime and homeless and everything else. That's all done. And basically, they don't need any more officers. It just doesn't make sense to me. And so here we are, and I went to a really nice function with the city, and they had the officers in red surge, and they're all saying, well, of course you won't hear it now, they're getting in the car and going to the city all the time, but you won't see that at the microphone here or something like that. But that's what the guy on the ground is saying to me. Now you can put me on a lie detector or something like that, but that's what they're telling me, that they work half time in the city and half the time in the township, and when the call comes in, they're going to the city all the time.
But
and mostly to do with that.
It works both ways, and I think we should focus on the
township
budget
but this is
and not worry about the
Mr.
city's
Mayor,
budget.
this is important because we were looking at a budget last week of 4 officers. Now we're looking at 10. That is a change, and I'm referring to document 11 here. Now we may need 10, we may need 20. I'm just saying, what point in time? How are they? Okay, my next question. Here we go. Page 12. Now, are we going to add 3 officers in 21, 22, 23, and 24?
So this is just for discussion. The 10 is the item that came up in Councillor Woodward's program, but the other items are just what would be needed for this COP to POP ratio to drop under 900. So those numbers can be played with and varied. We can take longer or shorter. As soon as you change any of them down, what happens is these latter two numbers start to go up over the 900 range in the COP to POP.
Okay, and my very last question, hopefully it won't be my last question today, because at the budget, and we have to ask, it's important to ask lots of questions,
Yes.
is now that they have gone union, which was in 2019, I guess fall of 2019, they have made that move, the RCMP, to go union. They're going to be wanting a contract. Are we putting money aside for that as well?
Yes, we've been accruing on the financial statement side of things in our books. We've been accruing each year, and we've also added to the budget.
So where does that in our budget documents?
It's part of the contract increase that you see for,
Okay, that's
for the
all
RCMP. Yeah.
between it. So it's QP, fire, police, and exempt. That's everybody?
Yeah, the RCMP shows up as a contract increase because they're paid for through a contract, but yes.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Maybe I can help just put it in a little bit of perspective. The last census, which was over a 5-year period, I believe we increased by about 12,000 population, and the city increased by about 800. So definitely the growth is in the township, and I certainly understand, we have a formula between the city and the township, but we're the one that's seeing the growth, and that growth comes more need for police. So I think there's a little bit of a different story here for policing. So bear that in mind. We're growing about 3,000 a year, 2,000 to 3,000 a year. The city is growing by, 100, 200. So.
But Mr. Mayor, if I just, I'm not correcting you. I'm just saying that the policing, and I said this when Inspector Power was here, our superintendent, is policing has changed significantly. And I love talking to those guys. I get a room full of them here. And I was sitting at a table with about 10 officers, all in red serge, and they agreed with me, or they even helped me out. They said, we're doing more work in the city. We do different things in the city. There's a bigger homeless problem in the city. There's a different concentration of population because it's Foursquare. Policing has changed, other than I just joked around than up at the DW Pompey area. It's a lot different. Policing people up in, say, Milner or Salmon River Uplands than it is in the city of Langley. That's all I'm saying.
No, fair
so that's why you need more officers, because of concentration.
Thank you. Councillor Whitmarsh.
Yes, thank you. So this particular item, I certainly like the idea of developing a strategy to keep our numbers at the appropriate level for officers, and also to smooth out the process from year to year with some kind of reserve. So I do like that. I've sort of went through all sorts of scenarios over the weekend of different numbers and different ways of looking at it. And I'm wondering, for me, I guess my question is around why the need to try and solve the number in 1 year. It looks like we're adding 10 officers, which takes us to the below the POP to COP, or COP to POP, whatever number, all in 1 year. And that's great, but in light of the challenges we're having with the budget, I'm wondering if we were to slow that down just slightly. And so I went through some various number scenarios, and I probably don't have all the exact numbers, but looking at something like 5 officers this year, and then 2 years another 5, and then 2 years another 5. That would still get us our 15 officers, but instead of doing 15 officers in 3 years, it would take us 15 officers in 5 years, which does make quite a bit of difference in terms of the amount of money we put into this on an annual basis. It does reduce the tax burden, and still gets us to 15 officers within a reasonable amount of time, and I think still builds up the reserve. I don't think it has to be at $750K a year. I looked at numbers more around the $500K per year, which could actually get us 15 over 5 years. The other thing I was wondering about was the idea of looking at bylaws in kind of the same way. I think the staff recommendation or idea was to have 1 bylaw officer, and the proposal received on the weekend was for 3. And so I'm not sure where we went from 1 to 3, but I recognize the demands are increasing for bylaws, and wondering if that, rather than just an RCMP reserve, as was suggested, that we actually call it a protective services reserve, which would consider RCMP and bylaws, because I think as we grow and develop, and there must be some kind of formula based on what we might need for bylaws as well. And I think that a reasonable number, probably around the 500 to 600 range with inflation could accommodate both RCMP if we slowed it down slightly and allow us to smooth out the process with bylaws. It would save money in our budget, allow us to direct things in other ways, and allow us to grow protective services at an appropriate rate that would match the way our community is growing. We do know that our growth actually percentage-wise has decreased last year, and we may see some slight decreases in actual percentage growth over the years based on all predictions. So I think a slight slowing down, certainly we need to improve it, but a slight slowing down in the RCMP would allow us to save money. And putting it into one protective services reserve, I think, makes more sense. Thank you.
Councillor Long?
Thanks, Your Worship. Well, you know, this fund that these surplus money, so it's protective services money that we've been collecting taxes for. Whether there are officers on the road or not is a good question, but it still goes into protective services. And I remember this, I'm sure other councillors would too, because there's supposed to be a second floor or third floor added to the RCMP building. So I think we've been putting money aside for that. The chances of that happening seem to be slimmer and slimmer, but there will be some need of some kind of improvement to that building. So we didn't have a reserve, I suppose, that we were building up specifically to replace the building. But we thought, oh gosh, with all this extra money that we can't spend because we can't get the officer is a good way to fund it. Is that one way to look at it?
We have been funding some of the capital works required by the RCMP building over the last few years. It's just been required over the last few years. Some of the security infrastructure. We have had several projects that we have internally borrowed from the RCMP fund, like you might recall the sound attenuation wall for 216th Street and the 96th Avenue sidewalk. So we have over the years, and some parks in the
Well, that came out of the RCMP?
Yes, it's there as a placeholder to be repaid back from prior year surplus, but we have...
Rating it already. But what is then the plan for the building replacement or expansion, especially if you throw 10 offices in there, where are they going to work?
Your Worship, so the concern about the building is, as to a third floor, is its construction and the standards to which it was built geotechnically may not make that feasible. So it may be able to be expanded over the parking lot, for example. There are some opportunities to expand, but then there's the dislocation that occurs while that construction is underway. One of the other reasons why we have the reserve, though, is we do have the provision to actually acquire the other partner's interest in that building, and then they can. There's provisions and a formula that's used that we could then utilize to take over the building that would effectively give us the same result as an expansion, and that we'd have more space because we dislocate the partner's complement, and they would, through the agreement, have a period of time to create their own location.
Okay, well, that's interesting. But I mean, it does mean that we have to continually think about what this reserve was set up for, where the money may be pegged to go, rather than just saying, okay, here's money we found under the stairs. So the thing that concerns me then with all of this stuff in the memo, it's really intriguing, is where do we see the actual responses from the department heads in terms of these proposals? So we need, superintendent isn't here, he's probably out in the city busting crime, but we need to have, I think, don't we, Council, a response from the superintendent as to this proposal, and so we'd be looking forward to that and others. Now, here we are at Protective Services. Did we go over Parks? Wasn't the previous slide, because this is contribution to capital, Parks was left to where it was?
Parks was left the way it was, correct.
So was that in the previous slide? Can we go
yes,
back to it?
Yes, it was, yeah.
Because we jumped right to this one, but I was concerned about that. Okay, so you got roads, facilities, parks, storms. So most of them have been cut back, so that's the discussion we've had about roads and facilities. But what about parks? Parks hasn't been touched, and one of the and I don't want to be squirreling everywhere here, but we had a list of items that were flagged, and one of them was, hey, what's the deal with these two parks? One was Yorkson and one was Milner. And we were waiting, I think, for a response from staff saying, is it underway and we don't actually need the money this year? Or, as the memo is suggesting, do we need to bring that money back in? Because that is part of the rationale here, was to get this Yorkson and Milner going. But, Your Worship, I guess those 10 or 11 items that were flagged, should we not maybe be talking about them even first?
I do have some slides to deal with the items, the capital items that were flagged coming up. The ones that were identified in the Q&A, I brought them back here just to have that sort of final putting a button on it in terms of those.
So we're going to have to hold that part of our brain aside for that.
Yeah, so we'll move through this to get discussion.
And I do believe I have some
Councillor
information.
Davis.
Sorry, I'll be fast. Can you question through the mayor. How much does the federal, Councillor Ferguson said we can't rely on the feds, but we hire the policemen, we hire the police cars, and what does the federal,
The federal pays 10% of the contract.
And does provincial pay something?
No.
So I thought in 2011 that the federal was a lot higher. I thought it was way higher than 10%. I guess maybe it wasn't.
10%. Yeah. It's always been 10% for the last several years and based on population. So,
yes?
But capital is responsibility, like buildings of the municipality. Cars are part of the contract. Is that correct? Yeah. So the building is responsibility of the municipality, 100%, and the contract, which includes the cars, is responsibility.
Okay.
Yeah, they do 10%. The federal.
Okay, but I should carry on for lack of time.
Yeah.
The RCMP contingency planning reserves, that's a simple thing. Well, to me, you just put it in the computer, and then that's when it gets complicated. But can you not? I don't know if you want to put that in, because we borrowed out of it. If we borrow out of it, we're going to have to put it back in.
Right.
So then that gets complicated down the road. So I like the idea of doing that. Like we could have a bylaws RCMP. We could have, we basically do a lot of that. But I just when we have a placeholder, it makes it easy for us to bum some, and that I don't know if that's the
borrow.
Okay, you know what? I'll carry on. We're going to. Sorry.
Thanks, Councillor Arneson.
Yes, thank you, Worship. Yeah, just quickly, because a couple of other councillors have pointed this out, so I think it's helpful to talk about this whole exploration of how many new officers we should have and the time frame for that, because there is this potential, from my perspective, the unintended consequence. Because when we look at that, we don't necessarily assume the cost of a building or where these individuals who are currently, as I understand it, needing more space, as others have alluded to. So for me, what would be more helpful is if you were going to create this fund, you had more detailed information similar to what we get when we have an understanding of if you have an officer and this is the extra money that they need for a car and equipment and all those kind of things. So I think it must be a rational formula to figure out if you have 10 new individuals, do we currently have the capacity? And if we don't, then how are we going to create it? And where is that money coming from? Do we have, relatively speaking, and then also rationally speaking, should we reconfigure a building that we have? Shall we do something about that, or do we have to look for another site? So all of these things are potentially very capital heavy, and so I would look to further details about that. I don't have any comment regarding the number, but I do know from various reports that I've read that other communities are struggling with the issue that we have increased populations relative to our ability to be able to put forward and have in our community further police resources. And some of them are actually working to lobby the federal government in order to get a percentage increase of the actual levy that we get from them, saying it's not sufficient anymore, because this is not just, from my perspective, what I've seen in the township of Langley, but other communities are challenged in the same way. And so I know we're not looking to a private police force. That would be unreasonable, but at the same time, I do think we'd be helped by this idea that perhaps we should consider looking for extra help in order to supplement the costs that we're going to incur.
Okay, everybody's spoken once. I'll go through the second time. We should move on pretty quick because we're running out of time. Councillor Richter, the Woodward, Whitmarsh.
Okay, so I just want to go back to this reserve fund. So we've been rolling operating surplus into this reserve fund up to this point in time, and that operating surplus, so the reserve fund is set up for capital right now. So we would have to change it to allow us to use it for operating going forward?
Right.
Okay. Now, Mr. Backen mentioned that our partners, buying our partners out. I had understood over the years that one of the purposes of this reserve fund was to build up enough money so we could indeed buy the partners out, so we wouldn't have to build a new building. And so I'm just wondering, how much do we need to separate from Langley City right now in terms of policing?
It's actually quite a complicated formula that we couldn't really answer here today because it depends upon the value of the additions, the value of the building, the depreciation that it's incurred, and as a result, there's a formula that brings you to a number. Karen and I have actually talked about that, and it's quite an undertaking to update that, but we are estimating probably in the range of $5 to $7 million, but that is just a very rough estimate from what we're seeing.
So that's what we would have to pay the city, $5 to $7 million.
That would be our calculation. They would have to do their own calculation, and they may come to a completely different number, and then there's some provisions for, I guess, dispute resolution on that. But we don't have any firm numbers at this time to cement that. We've done some very, very, very preliminary work that's now a few years old.
And do we have to give them a certain notice period?
It's about 24 months.
24 months, okay. Now, if we did separate from Langley City, would we need to respond to their calls? Because I have a tendency to agree with what Councillor Ferguson has been saying in that our guys are responding to their calls.
It would depend, I think, on the nature of the detachment, in that if this was to be truly an independent detachment reporting directly to E Division, they would be the equivalent of Surrey helping the township. They'd be independent detachments. If this detachment or this entity was set up to be a subset of the existing detachment, then there would be the commander's discretion to dispatch calls as was required.
Okay, now, if can we do a charge back to them? So if, we probably can't now because it's one detachment, but if it was two separate detachments and our forces were responding to their calls, can we get paid for that?
Usually there are provisions, usually by way of an agreement, that would have to be structured for reciprocal calls, as is done, say, in the fire service, some of those provisions. So the short answer is yes, but it does require an agreement to be negotiated between the parties.
Okay, and so that's something that would be done over this 24-month period, right? Councillor Arneson raised a very good point with respect to the unintended consequences. And the first thought that jumped into my mind on that one is, how many new support staff would we need for 10 new officers? So, I mean, we have a lot of civilian staff that support the RCMP. What is it? Is it a 2-to-1 ratio, like 2 RCMP per support person, or? And do we have the space to add in 10 officers plus the support persons?
The support persons are a good question. We'd have to actually revisit that because effectively it's adding individuals to the ident or some of the support functions that exist. As to locations, there will be a long-term reckoning that needs to be done as our needs continue to grow. Perhaps not at this level, but as we continue to look at the size of the detachment, there's going to be some ongoing needs. In the interim, what the superintendent has tried to do is use existing locations. Some of the existing CPOs have been adapted, I guess, to become dispatch stations, and I think his intention would be to continue to use those as a way to augment it until we had a longer-term plan.
So it almost sounds like this should be a priority for us to be considering over the next year. Do we want to make that cut with Langley City?
That's another discussion, I think.
Yeah.
Subsequent to this budget, but not. Okay, good thoughts. Thank you. Councillor Woodward?
Yeah, I just want to respond to some of those good comments because I think that's a natural inclination to want to take 15 or 10 in 1 year and spread that out, 5, 5, and 5. The problem is, as I've started to learn a bit more about how this works, is that, we put in that request for 5 in 2022. They don't show up till 2023. And even then, we're still not getting the full complement of what we're being taxed for is not actually on the street, given some of the logistics with the province and the federal government. And so this is why I put it in the memo, sort of bold leadership action to take charge of the issue, and then maybe look at the following 5 in the subsequent years. And then, the numbers we're talking about, say next year we took, the annualization of these 10 is 1.8 million. And we're building in 700 into the base budget this year. We build in 350 next year, pull 350 from the reserve. That reserve is going to go up by the operating overflow by, I'm just guessing, $1 million or so. Because again, we're not at that authorized strength. So what I've learned is that we're taxing people for RCMP that we're not actually getting on the street. And then in some cases, we're using that reserve to build sidewalks. It didn't seem to be a concern. So I actually have a philosophical issue that if we're taxing people for RCMP, they should be getting RCMP. And I think this proposal has come up with a way to get there in a really manageable tax increase mechanism using that reserve, which is, we're talking 300,000-400,000 versus a reserve that's currently going up about $1 million here, right?
Yeah.
So I find that's why I use the word strategic use of this reserve, but still building it up for its intended purpose and potentially looking at options like that and what they cost either for a CPO or looking at a split of the detachment over the long run. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Whitmarsh.
Yeah, just a quick question. What currently the reserve, the RCMP reserve is at what amount right now?
4.5.
4.5. And how much is on sort of generally used from that reserve on an annual basis?
Lately, it's just been the work that's being done at the RCMP. I think for the most part, it's just been the security renovations that facilities is doing at the RCMP building.
Okay. So out of that 4.5, at this point, we don't have sort of a designated amount or that will be needed in the future for the building or building expansion, or we don't sort of have a plan
Not
for
building
that?
expansion, just facilities would probably have some items in there in the remaining 4 years of the 5-year plan to do at the RCMP.
Right. Okay. That's helpful. Thank you.
Oh, so if there's about $1 million a year goes into that reserve, why don't we just use that $1 million this year to fund those officers?
Because it's only one time, that amount that goes in,
We
yes.
have to have the percentage in there for,
Yeah.
Councillor Ferguson.
Thank you. I think that Councillor Richter, she hit on something that we did discuss. I'm sure you're aware, Councillor Richter, a number of years ago that there was the same question that came up talking about the RCMP, a separation of them.
I'm just going to say we need to focus on this budget, and if there's a discussion, just in interest of time, if there's a discussion on separation of the detachment, which is a good discussion to have, it really should be for another day, and just because we're running out of time. So, yeah, but that's fine. It's a good comment, but it's not pertinent to this budget. That's right. That's right. Oh, yeah. Okay. Excuse me. Yeah. Excuse. Okay. Excuse me. I'm just saying, just cautioning Councillor Ferguson. It's a good discussion, but in interest of time, we have an hour and a half left. We've gone through 11 pages of a. Okay. I'm just saying if it's adding to that discussion, let's have it, but another time. Thank you. Okay, I think that's exhausts the speaker's list.
And then this is a list of positions and other programs or projects that were requested by staff in the Woodward plan. These items are not being funded at this time.
Okay. And these are, so this has been reviewed with the various departments that these positions. Now, will they need to come in next year? Are we going to be adding them in next year?
They'll be bringing them back, next year.
Okay, thank you. Okay, move on.
And now this is getting to the category of other amendments or other adjustments. So this starts off with the roads DCC reimbursement for important land acquisitions. I've just pulled this item out of the memo itself and then showed it in our format down below, which is essentially the same thing. So what is happening here is you'll recall at the last meeting we were voting on the DCC, or I say we, council was voting on the DCC program. And at the last minute, Councillor Woodward passed an amendment to it, or asked for an amendment to it, to add the 212th connector for $15 million into that DCC program, which once that's approved will then make that connector eligible for DCC funds. So what this does is this recognizes that the DCC program, because it's related to growth, is going to pay back the township proper, general taxpayers, if we look at it that way, is going to pay back the general taxpayers for that connector land that is part of an assembly that we've already purchased. So we've already purchased that land assembly and we're paying for it from general revenues through the taxpayer. This will have the DCC program reimburse the taxpayer this much per year for 7 years. And the idea is that it will have to be, an amount will have to be annualized each year. There was I don't know if I have, do I have that? There you go. So the difference between 2020 on this chart right here, this is the amount that would need to be annualized into the budget every year. So the first year we'd use the 2.7 million of the 15 million. The second year we would replace that 2.7 million with 2.6, so we'd have to annualize that difference of 150, and then it would work that way down to, by the time we got down to here, we would have it all built into the base. So it allows us to incrementally build that capacity in the base funded from property taxes at the end of the day. But it allows us to use the DCCs to pay the tax-paying taxpayers for a project that is related to growth.
Thank you. Councillor Long?
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. I heard you say that if it's approved, so does it have to go to the province or somebody to approve that 15?
Yeah, so the DCC program is with the ministry right now for approval.
So how can we entertain that if we don't know yet if we're going to get it? And what did we have? We must have had a plan already because when we bought the land, we knew the road was going to go through there. So
That I'm not
it's
familiar
kind of odd that all of a sudden that's again more money we found under the stairs, because we knew when we bought that land that road would have to go through. The DCCs would likely pay for that road, but is that what we're waiting for? Is that the DCCs would pay for construction of that road? The land value is interesting, and it got added.
If the land wasn't, the DCC program did not include the land initially, like in its original form. It typically, in not many cases, in some cases it does include land, but in most cases it doesn't include land. But in this particular case, with this being such a growth-related asset, it was requested that it go into the DCC program, the land.
When will we find out if it's approved?
We hope soon, because the ministry's had one look at it already, and they did have some issues with properties that we had in the plan that were owned by the ministry. So we hope that when they get it back, it'll be pretty much.
Oh, Your Worship, doesn't that hinge now on this whole proposal will be hinging on the approval, right? Or what?
So the fallback to this, if for some reason it wouldn't get approved, is that we would have to draw that from our reserves.
Perhaps to reiterate then, the challenge we're facing with the road alignment itself is it really for the existing residents or based on growth? Truly a major factor is growth. As such, it's appropriate to have something like that in the DCC program. In the circumstances we're looking at, the inclusion of this item in the DCC program is not contentious because it meets all the tests that the ministry has in terms of being an appropriately described DCC matter. So then the result becomes then the timing of its approval. It should be happening fairly quickly, as Karen says, because this is not a new application of the DCC program to the ministry. It's really a continuation of a previous one with the refinements that they've sought, and then the inclusion of an additional matter that is meeting the parameters that they've set. So with that, we would anticipate it to be fairly quick. Having said that, if it was not to occur, it'd be very easy for us to adjust on the fly to simply have that funded from surplus on a one-time basis. It's not our preference, but we have that sort of flexibility. But it does, again, bring some challenges as to the liquidity Karen seeks to achieve. But for a one-time, I think that would be sufficient till we could regroup and retool. But it really, there should be no issues in it being included.
So it's kind of it's risky, I think. But I mean, the other concept that I grapple with is that the funds that have been put into the DCC program by development is for future works. Now, this road going through, I suppose, is somewhat legitimate. Well, it is. We're hoping that it's going to be approved. But you would still think somewhere along the line that DCC money has to go, or should go, or appropriately should be put towards hard infrastructure. It's very odd that this is now funding a sort of a, don't want to upset anybody, but almost a political reduction in a tax increase. It's funding, what looks like a good number, whereas it's supposed to be, DCCs are there to build roads and infrastructure. So even though I guess it's legal, and I did ask that earlier in an email, and apparently it is legal, although now we have to make sure it's approved before we can do it. But is it ethical? Is it the right thing to do to take DCC monies and put it into operating? And I don't know if you can answer that, but I mean, if you're sure we're not going to get, are you sure that we're not going to get caught up on this one?
Your Worship, I think we go back to first principles, and as was outlined, what we're talking about is really the construction of a road. The only distinction is that rather than the road, the land underneath the road being provided, it's being provided by the general taxpayer. Ordinarily, we would have development provide those that amenity, and in this case, we're seeing a creative way to do just that. We reverse the program and allow development to pay for the land underneath, because ordinarily it would be provided by development. In this case, it's going through a site that'll effectively be a park and school site at some point in the future. So it does seem appropriate that it to be modeled that way. The impact it will have then on the overall program in real dollars, it's significant, but in terms of as an overall percentage, it's truly not. This is probably one of those opportunities that comes along very rarely to actually see the alignment of the provision of such a site and the ability for development to pay for it when it's not actually developing the site itself.
Thank you.
Okay.
Councillor Whitmarsh.
Yeah, thank you. This is an interesting idea. It's interesting to me because it's we bought the land at the land assembly, purchased it at 67 million. We're really getting 15 million of it paid back to us. So in essence, it's $52 million that would have or could have come from the taxpayers. This money could be used for a variety of things, and yet we borrowed 67 million. So in essence, we borrowed money to get this 15 million. I understand. I'm not concerned about the legality of it. It's sort of philosophical. What do you do with the? You've borrowed 67. You're getting 15 of it paid back through DCCs, and we're now deciding to take the 15 million and put it into operating budget to cover our operating, to lower our tax rate, as opposed to using it for other projects, for building roads, for whatever, or for paying down debt. The 67 million, we could reduce that down to 52. I'm not sure how all that would happen, but we have this money, and so this is just one way of using it. I think it is creative as a way to do it, but it is putting it into operating, and so every year we're going to have to pay it back on a accelerating level. So within 7 years, according to the plan that's in front of us here, we would have to have fined 2.75 million from some other source, whether that's future taxes or other source, to try and come up with the 2.75 million that we've now put into the budget to lower taxes for this year. So I think it's a philosophical decision here. Do we use it to lower tax rate currently? Do we use it to pay down debt? Do we use it to build roads and projects? What do we use $15 million that we're paying interest on? What do we use that money for? So I like the concept. I think I'm probably philosophically I can appreciate the concept of it. If we were to do it, I'd probably like to see it rather than 7 years, do it a little bit quicker. Maybe again, I've played around with lots of numbers and doing it maybe over 5 or 6 years. But I'm kind of torn. I got a foot on both camps on this one. It's a philosophical decision, I think, on what we use the money for. Thanks.
Your Worship, to comment on the technical, not the philosophical, that's in Council's realm. The technical thing that's occurring here really is that the township has acquired land, this is conceptually, and is using that land, disposing of some of that land at a positive return. And then we're doing it through a bit of a complicated process where we're actually ensuring it's being used for public purposes, and the public purposes are then being used to offset some of the revenue requirements that we have. I'd have to emphasize there's no direct link between the sale and the actual use of the funds. That's something we can elect to do, as was referenced, and there's many potential uses. Why we think it's a good thing at this juncture, though, is bridging on the philosophical. What this budget process, I think, is highlighting that there is a significant number of philosophical and policy issues that Council is going to have to grapple with going forward. This is our fourth budget session, as was referenced. What's the path forward? Council needs more time. We've been grappling with trying to structure that to give some relief to it so we can actually try to figure out a process that's going to deal with some of those peripheral budget issues, which are the philosophical and policy issues going forward. That's not for today, but this budget, as we work it through, highlights that, and we think that there's a need for at least an interim or in-process measure to actually put a budget in place that meets all the concerns of Council as best we can, and then come back and address some of those harder issues, which will be philosophical and which was outlined earlier in the domain of Council.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Woodward.
Yeah, I want to try to help a little bit here with this, because I think you and I spent a fair amount of time sort of working through this after Council added this to the DCC program. So the philosophical argument I'll start with first. That was a unanimous, I think maybe can't remember how Councillor Long voted, it's usually no. Almost unanimous addition by council to add that to the program. So it's not philosophical now to try to leverage that to manage the absorption of a strategic sort of visionary land purchase, in my opinion, into the budget. I wanted to correct, because I don't look at it this way. I don't look at it as taking DCC money that's now owed back to the taxpayer and spending that to reduce taxes, because what we've done is we've taken this money every year and we're absorbing that $3 million into the base budget over a period of time, which allows us to tax more efficiently from our residents, but also fund other programs that would not have been funded if we don't do this mechanism. Would that be fair to characterize it that way?
Yeah, I didn't mean, if it came across this way, that was incorrect. I didn't mean to say that we were owing it back to the DCC payers. I meant to say that this is one way of, through the DCC programming and having a cost that is part of the DCC program, to pay back the general taxpayers for the borrowing costs.
And I think it might, and to be fair, I've been working on this for a while, a little bit sort of batting ideas around and exploring some different options, and council's only had it for a few days. And so I recognize that, but I don't think it's fair to say that in 7 years we're now looking for this 2.75. That's not how these numbers work. It's permanently absorbed. And in year 4, for example, if we get some money, Mr. Baggin, maybe you can jump in here too. If that school site and park site initiative works out with the Ministry of Education, we could be looking at redeeming some of that debt when the principal comes back, given the temporary borrowing structure. Maybe you can remind council about that, and
yes.
Mr. Baggin can jump in as well.
Going to temporary borrow for the land, so that if something does happen by way of a land sale, say for example, within the first 5 years, we can only temporary borrow for 5 years, and that keeps it fluid for us to be able to borrow less when we have to firm it up. So during that period of time, if that happens, we'd have the opportunity.
Mr. Baggin, do you want to help with that a little? Does anybody add anything to that?
That's correct. As Karen was outlining, we're looking at the borrowing as being interim for a 5-year period or less, because we are optimistic that during that time period, the school district will receive funds to acquire a portion of the lands for the joint park and school site. As you may recall, we're kind of advancing history on this matter by going ahead of the school district. Ordinarily, we go in tandem, but we would go ahead of them and acquire the lands, and then as part of the ultimate construction of the acquisition and construction of the facility on the hill, we'd then be able to actually charge them then market rates for it. At that point, we could retire the debt or look at other opportunities. That'll be the jurisdiction of council at the time, but we'll certainly have those options going forward.
Yeah, so I'm going to add to that. So potentially what this is doing is it's using a sort of a unique opportunity to build in that borrowing into the base budget, Mr. Backen, and we get some of that principal back. We could then potentially, redeem debt or roll that into another project that we need, such as anything from a new maintenance yard to a CPO to a performing arts center. That principal debt borrowing is now permanently in the base budget for any project we could leverage or use it for in the future. Would that be correct?
No, that's correct, and even more so, the disposition would be at then market rate, so there's actually the chance for a return as well on the investment.
Yes, correct. So I think that's ask council to take some more time, to really see how this is working and the legitimacy of this plan with a DCC program, which again highlighted in the memo, has seen record receipts this year, is seeing a significant increase with the new bylaw, which will kick in 2021, with development that, from what I'm hearing, is not slowing down by any measurable amount. So we're talking about a 10, 15% maybe of the starting off, but then that decreases every single year. I wanted maybe to highlight for that as well. By year 4 and 5, we're pulling 1 million out of the DCC program when we could be generating who knows how much based upon the higher rates. Would that be correct?
Yeah.
So this is getting healthier over time. It's a few difficult years, but then that health starts to really improve and the pressure decreases on the program. Would that be correct?
I have a slide that's following, so it may speak a little bit for itself, but maybe. So this is sort of a future look, because I hear what we're talking about with this idea, and I think it's very creative and a unique idea, and I just think we should make it with all the information. So this is just a look at the next 5 years.
Or you just don't interrupt you, because I think that there might be more questions about some of this impact on the DCC program, because we've been tending to oversubscribe the program so that if money comes in, we have the envelope to spend it.
Correct.
Which maybe we should dial that back a little bit. Because some of the DCC projects this year I did request information on, haven't received it yet. So still working on that to help make some of those decisions around the specific projects to maybe not oversubscribe it. But I did want to just mention that I do take offense to the suggestion from Councillor Long this is somehow unethical, and I'm going to reiterate that whenever I sort of do something even close to that, I'm cut off. But it seems to be acceptable when Councillor Long directs those comments at me. And Mr. Chair, I would like you to address those comments in the future.
I think both ways. I'm just going to stop it right now. We're going to speak to the issues at hand and to the slides, and we're going to keep the personal out of it. So I think that applies to both Councillor Woodward and Councillor Long. So hopefully I've addressed it. So, excuse me. I'm not going to babysit everybody. I think we're all big people. You can figure this out. So all I'm saying is speak to the issues. I'm warning both, and actually it goes to all of council. So I think we're all big people here. We can move forward without personal attacks. Thank you.
So the next slide is just a...
I've got some speakers. Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Councillor Ferguson.
Okay, thank you. Now, I know that we have to look at different ways of servicing our community and looking at those. I've also had a chance to look at this, and in a community you have various tools, and you have your cost drivers, and to operate a community, you need your fees, your charges, your permits, and of course the development cost charges. But what comes down to at the bottom end of the day, if we can't find something for our roads or for new roads, or this road is heading to the new 216th freeway, which is a positive thing, then we have to look at creative ways. And I think, if I may, my question to Chair to staff, this is a one-time only deal on something like this, if I may, or is it? I'm talking about the 202, the road connector to 216th.
The concept's quite unique because it is a technique that could be used once or could be used in future if the circumstances permit. What makes this quite unique is the fact that it's the township that's acquired a larger piece of property, and a portion of that property is truly needed for development, or at least a significant portion of it for development. So it certainly, in theory, could be used again, but to see the circumstances that would permit it to be used again in this way would be fairly unusual.
Okay, so I understand where we're going, and I think that we've got a cost driver here, we've got a road here, we don't have a lot of options on what to do. It's a creative way of looking at it. I think it's certain we should look at, we should explore. I don't think it's something we do on a regular basis, but because of this type of road and how we address it and how we look at it, I think that it's certainly something we should consider. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Arneson.
Yes, thank you, Worship. Further to our usual protocols, I'm just wondering, because I know we have liaison meetings, and I'm wondering whether or not anybody in the township has pre-vetted this with the development industry to see whether or not they have any problems with us doing this. It seems to me we have historical patterns and trends of how we distribute and use those monies, and albeit a very creative use of those monies, I'm wondering whether or not it's something that they've been able to respond to in any way. I know it's going to the ministry, but those are the local level individuals that we deal with, and whether or not they have any concerns.
Aaron, just to comment then, the ministry is really as to the actual inclusion or increase in the DCC program of the miscellaneous road amounts from 10 million to 25 million. What council chooses to do with that is in the discretion of council. As to the initiative, this one or the whole budget initiative at this point, nothing has been taken to the public yet. That's something we're hopeful council will want to entertain in the very near future. But at this point, we've been very cautious to leave the discussion at the staff and council level so that council could, I guess, wrap their minds around some of the concepts and determine what it is they wish to see advanced.
Thank you. Councillor Richter.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I think this is a brilliant idea. It's definitely the epitome of creative accounting. And in my mind, it's way better than options 1 to 5 that were put on council's table last week, where we would actually go out and borrow $15 million in order to fund our little red wagon of projects. Now we've got the $15 million here, well, $11 million of it, that will allow us to do additional projects. And to me, it makes perfect sense. Like, we have incurred debt to buy land that's going to have a road on it that's needed as a result of the growth that's going on in this community. So the only question I would have, I don't think it's about whether or not it's unethical at all. I would just have a question of whether it's illegal, and I don't think it is illegal. It's just creative accounting. Do we need to get a ruling on whether it's illegal?
Okay. I think we wouldn't be doing anything illegal. It has to fall within the legislative authority. So I think it was explained that the bylaw is before the minister. Is it be Minister of Finance or who? Minister of Communities?
Minister of Community.
Minister of Communities,
yeah,
so
yeah.
in front of the minister, and for approval. So if it was not approved, we would not proceed because that would be contrary to the legislation. So we wouldn't be doing anything illegal or unethical. I think it's a philosophical decision on whether council wishes to see these monies spent in this way or
from a
another way.
philosophical perspective, I much prefer doing this than going out and borrowing $15 million in order to get projects done. I had another question with regards to the other items that were on the list on the previous slide, number 14. So from increase in property tax revenue from growth all the way down to property tax for land acquisitions to prior year surplus. Are we going through each of those as well?
On a couple of them I can speak to just directly from this slide. The increase in property tax revenue from growth is just an increase in the 2% that I usually use to estimate the growth revenue, and it's just pushing that up a little bit more to be 2.15 instead of 2. So I feel confident that that's probably a safe, maybe a little aggressively safe position. I think it'll be fine. The climate strategy requirements is an item that was in the operating budget for $305,000, and it is actually an item used by engineering department to prepare for grant applications. So this one we want to be really careful with. It's a reduction of that 305 down to 100, and I would just make the suggestion that maybe we could find it in a different way, but that's what it is. It's an operating item that was put forward as part of the 4.12, I believe. And yes, and it's just been reduced down to 100. And engineering has advised that they have started some of the work on the grant programs that they're working up to apply for. The fees and charges just recognizes that very shortly a fees and charges bylaw will be in front of you for your consideration as well. And this is taking an additional bump in revenues out of that program.
Like just regional visitors, what program is that?
I believe that, Councillor Woodward, is that to do with the differential pricing for township versus non-township? Yeah, differential pricing
On
versus township versus non-township. Sure.
Oh, okay. So putting in a higher fee if you don't live in Langley Township to use our facilities? Okay.
Sure.
I don't want to go down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
So that was in regards to the work that the Parks and Rec Committee did this year in looking at some options on dealing with the overhead burden that the play area, the water park portion of the ACUCC is placed on our operating budget, when 70% of the visitors to that portion of that facility are from outside of even both Langleys.
Really?
Yes. So
Do we have numbers on that?
Yes, that was presented at one of the recent council meetings, sent to Parks and Rec. So that is potentially looking at, when we see that bylaw, we'll be looking at finding around this number. And there's an assumption built in here, which I'm glad we're clarifying for council, that makes sense, that if we have 70% of the visitors to that facility coming from outside of both Langleys, that we can look at a significant increase to reduce the burden on the Township of Langley taxpayer to provide those amenities for the region at a significant cost discount, because I believe we were looking at a 100% increase last year. We went to 50 or 25, can't remember.
25.
Yeah, 25. The recommendation was for 50. We were looking at even some steeper increases. So this is building in an assumption around managing that issue this year, along with that bylaw. Thanks.
Thank you. So just following up, can we, as a council, put in, something that's not been approved by council into a budget when this is a bylaw that needs approval by council? So now we're presupposing that council will approve it. They may not, or may come out in a different format, which is completely separate. So,
right.
Is that something that we can count on in a budget when it's not approved, not an approved bylaw?
If we look at the risk side of it is, if that doesn't go forward, we would have to review in more depth all of our existing revenues, and I don't feel super uncomfortable with that amount. I think we could probably take a deeper dive.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. Just, yeah,
So very, very
it's a
quickly,
caution, that's all.
so that was in regards to, I think, Mr. Beck, and you were suggesting that this year that bylaw could come forward sooner than it did last year, not in like late April, but potentially sooner prior to the budget getting first and second reading. So we would have that decision prior to that?
Or concurrently, I think finance is working on that at this time. And
Yeah.
Karen can
So
update.
that was another assumption built in that you and I and Mr. Becken had discussed in regards to maybe seeing the timing of the fees and charges sooner this year.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, Councillor Richter, you have the floor. Do you have any more?
Yeah, well, okay, so if Ms. Sinclair could continue on, so minor deferrals to 2021, that's that previous page, or?
Yeah, those are items that staff identified, small items to either remove or defer from 2020 to 21. There's a $20,000 item, a deferral of some salary costs into the following year. $10,000 item. I wonder if I have it handy here, and I can tell you what they are.
So staff have basically vetted
Yeah, we
these.
found by squeezing, we found a few places that we could.
Karen.
Yeah. Thank you. That's okay. Oh shoot, this doesn't have the level of detail. Just sorry. I'm having a hard time remembering, but it was a 20, a 10, a 1, and a 55,000 was the largest item, and that was for software that we will require software subscription, but we won't require it till next year. The software is not going to come in time. Great.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Arneson? Oh, sorry, I thought you were done. The mill rate?
I do have slides on.
Okay, that's coming up. Yeah, there's Councillor Arneson? I don't know what happened there.
Thank you, Worship. I did have a follow-up to item number 3, the climate strategy requirements and the reduction of that amount of money there. And I appreciate your comments that we should be, I thought I'm reading into it, that we should be looking to fund that in its entirety from somewhere else to find that money. Because I'm, for the very small amount, and I know cumulatively it's all very important as numbers, but I really think that this is a new initiative and we shouldn't be at the gate underfunding it in a way that it's not anticipated. So I know it's challenging because it is an emerging issue and it's not one of those ones that we've been able to build up any funding and reserves, etc. And so out of fairness, I can understand that, there's this potential perception that we have other things that we may wish to use the money for to bring the budget down. But I think that this is a critical amount of money and very negligible relative to the improvements it can make. And I'm just going to speak as a Metro representative for climate action. I think that this would not be sending a good signal that we're, at the outset after saying that we were going to adopt this initiative, that we are reducing in any way what I find to be a very nominal amount of money in this category.
Okay, Councillor Woodward?
I just want to clarify very quickly again, some of the assumptions that go into some of these proposals. Can you correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Sinclair, but the total funding for climate strategy stuff with very little specifications, at least provided at this point, was over $1 million? Would that be fair? Reserve additions, climate strategy studies, some consultant reports was proposed in the budget over $1 million.
This is a slide that tries to bring it all together.
Okay, so that I just want to highlight before we get into the fact that we're not funding negligible amounts or that we're not in favor of climate change or something like that. That it was funded in the first year over $1 million and looked at some reductions in that amount in our first year, not cutting everything related to climate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's the last question. Thanks. Comment.
So this was just a look, just in the spirit of making sure that everybody has all of the information. This is what the DCC program looks like over the next 5 years. And of course, remember that when we see these numbers, we're talking about an increase in DCCs that we've received in 2019. And presumably with the DCC increases and with development not slowing down, if that is in fact happening, that it is not slowing down, then we should continue to have significant or sufficient DCCs to fund these projects. But I just want to make sure there is a potential, if the DCCs do wane at all, that we would be facing borrowing for some of the larger items on this list, potentially, like the 208 Street corridor. And I think there's a lot of work being done on that project, so I'm not sure it's to the stage where we could make that kind of a decision. But I just wanted to make sure that you had a look at the 5-year picture of the roads DCCs.
Thank you.
Now, on the items of the light industry and business, so this is a mock-up of two tax calculations. So the top tax calculation here is what you would see if we as a township had a tax increase of 3.96%. And one of the things I want to point out is that, whoops, you can see right here that the 3.96% is across all categories evenly. And that's how we've been setting tax rates for years and years and years. That's how we do it, how we apply the council-approved tax increase on all categories evenly. How the assessed values roll out, they just roll out the way they roll out. Whatever's happening in the industry sometimes elicits a shift because one category might increase by a little bit and another category might decrease by double that. So it's really just, this is the piece that we control. So the difference in what is being recommended here is that we still need to receive, we know we need to receive, in this scenario, 3.96 increased tax revenue. The same is true for the bottom one, just right here. You can see the same is true for the bottom one. We still need to receive 3.95 more tax revenue in 2020 than we did in 2019. The difference is if we peg residential and the other classes at 2.98 and just show the bump on light industry and business, will generate that 3.96% tax increase. And I should mention also that Surrey for the first time this year is doing this, and White Rock is considering it as well. So us accountants are hard to move, maybe. We're a little bit stuck in our ways, but that is definitely what that's doing. And here's the ratios. This is sort of what I've referred to in the past budget presentations as a competitiveness factor. So our light industry and business are 2.45 to 1 residential.
You want to switch to slide 18?
So what?
Or are you talking?
Oh,
yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, there.
Actually, I have the ratios.
Oh, you have it here too. Okay,
here too, yeah,
sorry.
just on the very end here, and
okay.
then I'll bring it back. Sorry about that.
Fair enough. Thanks.
So it's 2.45 and 3.14 to 1, and then in the calculation below, it's 2.51 and 3.24 to 1. So it hasn't shifted that extreme, too much of an extreme, which is great. So this next slide just sort of tries to bring it all together with some mock-up of sort of three examples. If somebody had properties that were worth residential 942, which was the average residential last year, 942, 948, and light industry for 8 million, and business and other for 2.5 million, applying 2019 rates, this is what they would have paid. 1,912 of municipal taxes only. We're not talking about other agencies and things like that. 49 million and 18 million. Then the second category shows the 3.92 across the board. So what would happen is the residential would pay 1.988. Light industry would pay 51,318, and business and other would pay 19. And then if we do the third method, which is 2.98 for residential and then 5.63 and 5.83 for light industrial and business, you can see that the residential goes down slightly, and there is in the completed roll, which is what I have right now, there is projected to be a slight softening of residential values. And then on the light industry and business, it goes up slightly from 2.45 to the 2.51 and 3.14 ratio to the 3.23. And you can see the absolute dollar value that they changed by.
So just to be clear, so the bottom row of ratios is still lower than what is current in 2019 taxes.
Yeah,
so
and the reason why those ratios change and can go lower is just because of the way the assessed values shifted. Yeah.
So over time, as taxes increase, and if every category is at the same increase, over time, does that change the ratio and bringing the higher taxed, I guess the higher dollars taxed entities lower? So what I'm seeing here, is that consistent over time? Or is it just an anomaly when
every year? Yeah, every year is quite different. For example, this year they're saying that residential is going to go down. This is at the completed roll stage,
right.
Down by about 5%.
Yep.
Light industry is going to go up by about 10, and I believe business was up by about 20. Oh, I actually have it here, don't I? Yes, there we are. 5, 18, and 10. boy, I was wrong. 5, 18, and 10. So that's what is in the completed roll, which is not the final roll, but in the completed roll, that's what's happening with assessed values. That can completely reverse itself in a coming year. It can be a minus 18 for business and a plus 10 for residential. So it's these ratios will change from year to year. But what I like that I'm seeing is that the amounts are not massive swings.
That's right, yeah. And I think, at least for me, I'd like to keep our municipality competitive with other municipalities and not see us become uncompetitive. And so my initial concern was the 5.63 or 5.83 would put us that. But this table is really what, I'm glad you have this here because it's really what I was looking for, is where do we sit in our ratios.
Right.
And so we're still within parameters. Okay.
To put it in some perspective, Vancouver and Coquitlam have been on a reverse trend where their business and light industry was like 7 to 1 of residential. So they systematically shifted the taxes to residential for a few years until they got into the realm that they were comfortable with.
That's something we shouldn't ever lose sight of. So.
Right.
Okay, thanks. Councillor Whitmarsh.
Yeah, thank you. Just a couple of questions. This, you can see that it, as you pointed out, hasn't made a significant difference from 1 year, from the 3.96 to the other adjustment here. How do we compare on tax rates compared to the surrounding communities? You mentioned Coquitlam, but what about some other, our neighbors, Abbotsford or Surrey, or in terms of tax rates for business and light industry?
The rates themselves don't have a lot of value to looking at the rates, but what needs to be looked at is this the ratio to residential, because the rates are so dependent upon what's happening in their municipality with respect to assessed values. It can be, and it also, it's not a great measurement, but I think what I've used before, and I don't have here today, is that competitiveness chart that shows where we are with our ratios versus where Abbotsford is with their ratios, where Surrey is with their ratios, and Coquitlam, so that we can see where we land in terms of our ratio of light industry and business to residential. So
right, but the ratios would only matter if the residential rates were consistent from one community to another.
Residential's always pegged at 1, and they're never consistent from one municipality to another. So it's a really hard comparison to do. I'm trying to think of another way to say it.
Well, I guess, yeah. I mean, I understand what you're saying in terms of the ratios, but if, for example, Surrey's residential tax rates were, or taxes were 3 times Langley's, then the ratio doesn't really tell us much, because 6 times the value of 3 times the value is quite significant. Right. So the ratios to me mean something as long as the residential rates are all relatively consistent from our neighbors.
That's the key. The residential rates are the stabilizing factor, because it's a huge number and a big denominator to move. So they do tend to hover around we look for them to hover around the same position with our neighbors. Right.
Okay. So the other question was around these mill rates. If we were to adjust them, moving this year here, is this considered, do we do this as a one-time and then every year we look at mill rates, or does this become the pattern for subsequent years?
That's a great question. This is the first time we're doing it. I will be interested in seeing how this impacts year 2. The only thing I could do to know how that would impact is to mock up a potential change for year 2 and do the calculation again, which would probably be a good idea.
So we're not, by making the decision this year, we're not locked in.
No.
For subsequent years. We can always go back to changing our mill rates so that they're equal again.
Correct. The only thing you're locked into is that the rate ratios have to be used for all of the different categories that you're taxing as a municipality. So the library, for example, when we calculate the library tax, it has to use these rate ratios. That's the only thing we're locked into, but the rest can be varied. Right.
Okay. So for here there's, it doesn't adjust it much in this 1 year, but I'm concerned about competitiveness and attracting business to our community. And that's one of the things that certainly is important, I think, to many of us on councils, that we attract business, we create local jobs. We certainly wouldn't want to be in a situation where if we did this for 3 and 4 years or 5 years, we get to the point where business doesn't want to come here and they're choosing to go to Abbotsford or Surrey or Maple Ridge instead because the rates are lower.
So just reflecting ourselves into next year as an example, so if we had 2.98% here, No, I won't. I won't go there. It's too confusing.
Okay,
Sorry.
that's okay.
Playing three-dimensional chess with myself.
That's okay. That's fine. That just helps me sort of
Yeah.
figure out what's happening. Thank you.
Councillor Richter?
Yeah, well, just to follow up on Councillor Whitmarsh's question, which was a good one. Is there a potential, I mean, now that Surrey's doing it, and who was the other one? White Rock's looking into it?
White Rock is considering it, and my understanding is that they said they're considering it because Surrey did it. And also POCO has a variable rate system as well. Yeah.
So it's possible that all the municipalities in the Lower Mainland, if they figure this is a good generation idea, will hop on the bandwagon.
It's
So
very possible.
it's
5
not
years
going
from
to
now
draw
will be-
businesses away
Yeah.
from us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I wanted to go to the major industry category on the previous slide. And I'm wondering why it's at 2.98. And if we decided to increase major industry, light industry, and business, that would bring the impact probably on light industry and business down a bit. If we did the three of them. So why couldn't we do the three of them?
The reason why I stayed away, I'm not sure why Councillor Woodward stayed away from it. The reason I stayed away from the major industries because it's a very few number of properties. I believe it's like five or six properties in our we don't have a lot of major industrial. Ours is all light industrial. So I feel like it would potentially, even though it wouldn't be a big amount overall, it might be big for those individual because there's so few number of units.
But still few of them.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. That explains it. Thanks.
Councillor Woodward?
Yeah, I just want to answer that. That's exactly why I didn't include major industry. I think it wasn't so much the quantity of properties, but on that pie chart you showed us last year, which showed us the revenue generated by property class, major industry was about this small. So any fluctuations or tweaking with that would be disproportionate onto a smaller number, which is why I stayed away for a bit. I want to highlight too, just to add some context, because I was kind of a leap of faith for me to propose this because I didn't have some of this information yet when I originally started to review this idea with you. So it was a bit of a leap of faith on my part to see what this would look like. And so I consider this really, primed and ready for public consultation and feedback from the business community. But I think some education is going to be important, and I'm going to note this for Mr. Backen and maybe the other staff that would be overseeing that. So correct me if I'm wrong, that as we add more economic development in the business and light industry categories, such as construction in Gloucester, such as new hotels, new business parks, no 4-story office buildings on the 200th Street corridor, that we're increasing the assessment base of that category, which means that there's more people to share that burden of that property class in terms of the 200 million taxation. Would that be fair? It's a little simplistic, maybe.
Yeah, a bit simplistic, but if all other factors remain the same,
so it's important to note that as we grow those parts of the land base and the property tax base here, that in reality their real dollar taxation might be flat or decreasing, because more of those buildings are coming into that property class, but we're not raising the taxes to keep up with that growth. Would that be, again, one way to put it? So maybe to look at a mill rate adjustment where business is not directly affected, individual business isn't paying much more. They've actually been seeing flat or decreasing real-world property tax bills. Mr. Backen, do you want to add to that? Maybe make sure I'm just trying to put it in a frame that this isn't sort of coming along and saying they're going to pay more. It's sort of trying to diversify the tax base based upon economic development that we've achieved as a municipality.
I think what you're going towards is the equity component, that in terms of real dollars and real value, if we didn't have inflation, where is the tax burden being proportionately shared? And there's a substantial argument that right now, because the tax rate is going at the inflation rate is going at 2%, there's actually a declining real value reduction in the taxes, or there's a declining real value cost in the taxes because of that. And I think by the broadening the base provisions that you're referencing, that could be made more equitable with the residential component.
Yeah, and so I think that's one way of putting it as well. So I just wanted to highlight for council that I didn't really look at it as a disproportionate increase on business, but that it's a more equitable, very minor adjustment is why I think you've highlighted that. 5.8 looks like a lot, but in terms of the actual dollar over the millions that we're generating from that category, it would be spread out among a number of people. The direct impact to an individual business owner may actually be negligible, given the flat taxes that, at least I've even seen that myself. Thanks.
This seems to be what I would call a sweet spot, for lack of a better term, but I did play around with these calculations in a case where we needed 6.63% overall increase, and it required, with residential getting 4.25%, the business and light industry would have to have 9-point-something%. So it can swing quite significantly. So this one is pretty close to the sweet spot as you'll get, I think.
Councillor Ferguson?
Yeah, I think it's important to stay competitive, but it's also important to always keep abreast of what's going on with their neighbors. And we always, and including folks on the rainy side of the river, Coquitlam and the Tri-Cities and things like that. I mean, it's important, and there's always going to be differences, but I think as long as we keep abreast of what's going on with Surrey, White Rock, and I'm not sure what Abbotsford, I got Abbotsford in there? But basically, I think that's important. I think it's good they're reviewing, looking at it now, because we have to have as many tools in the toolbox as possible. And did you have Abbotsford there? That's my question.
I have some charts coming up that do.
Now again, every community is a little bit different because they got that big airport. So and all that's going to do is grow. So I mean, other people have different. I keep calling them revenue sources. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on. Just to get a sense of where we are, we've got 40 minutes left, a little under. There's a lot of slides. What's your sense for the rest of the slides? Is it going to be, will we make it to the end?
The next, after we move through these slides that Council's used to seeing, I've used the Councillor Woodward's proposal. I have the capital items that were flagged is the next section. Okay. Should I just jump right to that?
Yeah, I think with Council, I think it's fairly straightforward. The other slides, basically the comparisons, and we can move on to where you think we can, just in the interest of time. But by all means, if there's a question Council has that goes back, that's certainly worthwhile.
Okay, so these are the items. These next few slides are items flagged for Council consideration, or that Council flagged in our last presentation. A couple of items that I bring forward here is one item is the Yorkson Creek Bridge was included in the program, and it was now I'm outside of Councillor Woodward's proposal now, and I'm back to the township just in general. Yorkson Creek Bridge is a project that won't get going in 2020, according to the park manager. So he needs a little bit of money to do the. It is a critical replacement project, but it's more for 2021. So he just needs to get started on it in 2020. And Councillor Woodward's proposal did include a $50,000 amount for him to get started, and then this was. We didn't actually get to your capital items. That's why this isn't coming up for me now. The balance of this was used to help balance the capital program, the additions. Yeah, Yorkson Community Park. So
it was shifted to Yorkson. Okay. Yeah. That's where it came from. Okay.
Yeah. So taking ourselves outside of Councillor Woodward's plan, this funding, just now going back to the original presentations that we had in the capital projects that weren't funded, this fund, 179,000 of this funding could be available. So what we did is we went back to the manager of parks, and he had some additional projects that he needed to fund, with this one being deferred to 2021. But it did leave 179,000 available. In Councillor Woodward's plan, he actually funded those projects that the parks manager needed to fund. So I think we're good there. The prior year surplus, per Councillor Woodward's conversation with me last week, we pegged an amount of $3.5 million. So based on that amount, which I have reviewed and I am comfortable with, we have about $836,000 that can be applied to some of the projects that we're about to look at that may need some funding. So that's my precursor to that. So you have about just a little around $1 million there.
Go ahead.
Thanks. So I just want to reiterate for council's. So last year, I listened very sincerely to when we did a budget amendment that I had set all the priorities, and so this year I listened to that, and I specifically didn't try to consume every ounce of the budget for a list of projects as a proposal. Specifically highlighted a couple of non-negotiables for me, which are Yorkson Community Park proceeding, and some RCMP and bylaw expansion, and I left everything else sort of on the table for council to discuss and consider as a group rather than attempt to consume that. So I wanted to highlight that for council, that I did that on purpose.
Everything's negotiable.
Not that you can't change it.
Okay, so this is now not part of Councillor Woodward's plan. So his capital is on page 6 of 8 for anybody who wants to look at it, and he's done it through a combination of reducing. So here's some of the funding sources. How Councillor Woodward came up with some of the funding sources for his. Actually, I do have the projects down at the bottom there. Sorry, there we go. So this is using prior year surplus. Some of the suggestions that Councillor Woodward has made. He's going along with the reducing of the legal defence fund. He's recommending to eliminate the council priority planning and to reduce the retirements overlaps, asking that we would just manage that internal to our 2020 budget with taking into consideration vacancies and things. So he's leaving $100,000 for that. The $60,000 here was removed by staff as more investigation taken out. And then this $250 was the property taxes, the one-time property taxes on the land assembly. And this chip seal treatment is moved over to the one times. It's required once every 5 to 7 years. It was part of the program, so it was taxing the property taxes because it was originally part of that $3.6 million large amount. So it's being bounced over to the one times, and we'll just have to put a placeholder in our calendars that we do it every 5 to 7 years. This is a better place for it. And then these projects down here are the projects that Councillor Woodward is recommending be funded from some of the savings generated.
I have a question on the Willoughby Community Hall parking lot improvements. I thought that was to come from development, from the developer on that site, that's where the funding was coming from.
It's currently unfunded at this stage, but...
So if it was,
Thank you,
I know it's unfunded,
I
but
think
the
you're
funding
referring
source was coming from Athenry.
The old development applications, I think, did include that provision for it. The challenge is the development has never actually proceeded. So we have one building, but I think it was a 3-building set. Right. And at the present time, there's no applications pending and there's no timeline for that. So I think this is simply trying to advance history and trying to deal with what's become a bit of a challenging area, because even right now, where some of the site growth, brush is beginning to grow back to it, and it's causing some complications.
So would there be an opportunity when that site goes forward that would come back to that we would be repaid for that? Because I believe it's in the, I thought we approved the development with this paving.
What we could seek to do is to try to recover from the bonding that will be necessary when that goes into place, some of those funds. But it's hard to predict exactly what that would look like, because we're not sure if and when that's going to that development's going to return. It may come back in a different form, which will actually give us more of an opportunity to do so. Okay. Was it rezoned already? The rezoning for the properties? It was zoned, and I'm not sure of the status of the DP. The DP may have lapsed, though, because it's been so many years. I'm not certain, and it may come back again. All of those will strengthen our position. Our challenge with this is we have no timeline as to when this may be finished.
No, I understand that. I just want to make sure we don't lose that. The initiative that was from that development to pay for that parking. That was, okay, thanks. Okay.
I should speak for Raman, with him not being here, that this 321,800 he spoke to quite strongly, that it's required for the priorities that were set out last year in the council priority planning, and some of them he has said are underway. They're underway this year, and that funding would help him carry on next year. So if this stays removed, we will be having to look internally to try and find replacement funds for that.
Worship, it actually speaks to a bit of a larger issue, which is in terms of we had a set of priorities. There was some revenues, some money set aside for those. They were advancing, and they still are advancing, and will, in some ways, shape or form, this can be overcome, this deletion, but it may have an impact on those priorities. But that speaks to the larger issue of what are the higher priorities. So I think it can be done consistently, but it may, I think the caveat is it may slow down or suspend some of those previous priorities until it's resolved. Hence why I think we'll have to have a larger policy and a philosophical discussion at a later date.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so there's that. And then this is going back to just the staff's discussion with council as to which items were flagged and what we could potentially do about them. This would be my version of the one times, and just taking out the items that we know, the 300,000, the 60,000, and there's a 836,000, because I'm not showing the projects being added here. So in this version, that 836,000 could be dealt with by council to fund items that have been flagged. And then again, this is outside of Councillor Woodward's plan. So if his plan is adopted, then this would not be done. So.
Thank you. Councillor Richter.
Yeah, so the 836 that was left over from Councillor Woodward's plan, so that would be available for us to flag some items?
Yes.
Because I know there's been 3 projects that have come up dealing with road safety. The crosswalk on 272nd and 28th or 29th Avenue. Some sort of traffic control mechanism at 56th and 240th.
Yep.
And then this whole issue around Robertson Crescent and 248th Street. I believe Councillor Davis sent around an email on that to all of council about getting big flashing stop line signs for four-way or something to that effect. Like, those to me are very pressing because they are road safety issues.
On this sheet here that I handed out just before we started, just at a glance, these are the capital items that were flagged, trying to bring them together in a spot that you can access quickly. And I do have a slide on, I do have some information on each of these. Some of them, the bulk of them actually are already funded, but there are some, and sometimes the question is, should they be funded or should we be doing something else? So the first item that is unfunded, well, there's potentially 2 items unfunded here. The first one that is unfunded per staff's presentation was the $300,000 for the stormwater climate action study. And so again, these pieces of the climate program are kind of pivotal in that each one of them is doing something different. So this stormwater climate action study, again, in light of what we've just been through, might be one that we should try and fund and could consider funding that one from the prior year surplus.
Well, shouldn't that come out of the stormwater?
The prior year surplus comes from all of the divisions, so it sort of goes into a pool, and then it's just done on a priority basis. But right now, the stormwater doesn't have enough funding for it, so that's why it's turned up below the line, unfunded.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, that's one I can come back to all of these too. So then the question was asked about the LED street lighting program, which is shown as funded from borrowing. At $4.3 million, and the question was asked, should we be doing that, or is there something more important? And the information that we received is that the project is anticipated to save about 8,500 gigajoules and 236,000 kilowatts annually, equivalent to annual electricity consumption of approximately 40 to 50 Canadian households on average per year. So there is definitely a good business case for this project to go forward. It is being paid for, the debt is being paid for by the savings. So it's not that those savings could be used to fund anything else. The savings won't occur unless this project goes forward. So it's sort of self-contained. The intersection improvement that I think, Councillor Richter, you were just mentioning, 56th Avenue and 240th. This is flagged, and my question to council might be, is it something that we can spread over 2 years? I don't know the answer to that. I'd have to rely on or get some feedback on that. Could it be funded over 2 years if it didn't get started till later this year? Intersection improvement, 28th and 272nd. Staff were asked to bring back some options, which they've done, 1, 2, and 3. And again, that could be considered from prior surplus.
So while we're on that, you mentioned Councillor Davis had flagged, was it Robertson Crescent and 248? Did I hear that correct? Yeah. And yeah. So I didn't see that here. Is that coming up?
I don't.
Okay, so
I might have missed that one.
Yeah.
He sent the memo around asking if it could
Okay. Okay, I missed that. So.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So. Well, yeah, there's been some issues there, perhaps rumble strips or something. And
Okay.
approach because it's been
So traffic calming potentially.
traffic calming. Well, yeah, I don't know.
Your Worship, I think we have a brief update. Mr. Zwag, do you recall, was that something that was being referred to 2020 or 2021?
Thank you, Mr. Bracken. Through the administrator, we recently were sent a number of service requests for the request of installation at the intersection of Robertson Crescent and 248. Following that service request, we completed a traffic count study, including truck turning movements and vehicles. And basically, the preliminary findings are that based on the standards, it does not warrant yet a full signalization. For council's background, this intersection has the flashing overhead lights, red if you're coming along Robertson Crescent, and of course orange along 248. So right now, based on preliminary findings, it does not warrant a full signalization. And this intersection already has the advanced intersection signs along Robertson Crescent and enlarged stop signs.
Okay, is there an opportunity to put rumble strips in just to warn people? Because I know I've seen those streets in Alberta where you're flying along a country road and there's a stop sign. There's some awareness before you get there, because there seems to be a fair number of accidents at that intersection. And so I'm just wondering if that's something that, I don't think you need a budget item for, but you certainly need to look at something more than what we have there. Not so much full signalization. That also causes accidents, you know. People fly through red lights. So.
That's correct, Your Worship. We can look at other traffic calming measures such as rumble strips, etc. I think the original question was, what was its status? Mr. Swag has updated us. If more severe or significant measures are needed, it would need to be something else that could be discussed as we go through the list.
Yeah, and that's for further discussion. Thank you. Councillor Woodward.
Yeah, I just want to highlight, too, that one part of the amendment that I proposed showed some funding of capital projects from some of the reserves. And one of them was, just want to highlight for council's information, was traffic calming, which you've shown as unfunded. That would be funded if my amendment was at least adopted for further amendments. So I didn't quite get there, but I just want to highlight that for council's information. There were some of those projects that I did find some money for. And there was a small mistake which was brought to my attention in regards to the use of the museum reserve, which I've removed and changed that. So you'll see that mistake in the document. And we haven't got to that yet, but if maybe we do at some point, I can explain some of the rationale for that. Thanks.
Wendy, is it possible to turn this on? That's the list of capital projects that Councillor Woodward's program funds. The items that say prior year surplus were on that other list that I just showed you, but you can see the first item is funded the Yorkson Community Park improvements. And the middle one there where it says 150, that's the traffic calming that has been mentioned.
Okay. Thank you. Councillor Richter.
Oh, no, I think
Okay. Councillor
I know. I did have a question. So if we wanted to play with getting some of these things on the list, do we have to take it out of their budget? Like, for example, the airport budget. I'm sorry, something's gone down the wrong pipe. The airport budget, if we wanted to demolish the old airport, do we have to take it out of the airport's budget?
I think Mr. Backen responded to that at the last meeting, saying that we might be able to get the developer to do it.
To the specific question, the situation provides for two options. One was that we incurred the cost. The other was that we effectively build it into the lease. So that's one of the issues. Overall, though, to some of the improvements, Karen, the bigger question, I guess, is, are we at the stage where to add something requires something to be removed? I think the answer lies in the fact that there's a certain amount of flexibility built into these numbers to about $890,000, give or take. So to the extent that we have that and it fits within that envelope, it's fine. But if we go beyond that, we either have to apply more from the surplus or reserves or substitute some projects.
Thank you. Councillor Long.
Thanks. Three things. On this page we happen to be looking at, I don't think we considered number 1 or number 3. It was only number 2 that was going to be, that council considered. If you check back on the notice of motion, I'm pretty sure that's what was listed in there, that it be a possession. And then the 250 was an estimate only, so it could be less than that. The other slide, if you wouldn't mind going to, which said, now I'm confused on this Yorkson thing, because I think you just told us that the Yorkson Bridge is not going to carry on, but in a previous slide, if you could find it, it showed 650 for it.
Yeah, Yorkson Bridge, this is confusing. Yorkson Creek Bridge is not going to go ahead in 2020, but Yorkson Community Park Development is in need of $1 million. And so in Councillor Woodward's plan, he had used the 650 from Yorkson Creek Bridge as partial funding for the
million.
For the million, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Councillor Ferguson?
Well, yeah, that was important to know. That was a question. The funding went to the actual park, which is important. On this particular page 27, I think that the 56 and 240 is an important project that we should flag or consider or put to the public, whatever the next steps are. The 28th Avenue and 272nd, I think that should be put to the public, but is there any other opportunity that we can use to look at the funding for the 28th Avenue and 272nd, if I may?
That is one that we could look at prior year surplus for.
Okay, and the reason why I'm asking for it, is there any other opportunity rather than the 250 or 350,000 regarded in costs?
Is there any other option, you mean?
Opportunity or option to construct that?
I think the question is, could it be constructed at a lower cost? Are there other options that might be available to deal with the issue? Mr. Zweig.
Thank you. I believe these two options were determined to staff to be feasible and implementable to our standards.
And it does mention that traffic calming is not permitted per the traffic calming policy, which would possibly be why there aren't some options that look like traffic calming.
Yeah, just so when I go through the design or look at, perhaps there might be an opportunity to review it in a different matter. I'm
Sure,
not an
yeah.
engineer, but I just wanted to flag that and leave that and put it to the public as well. Thank you.
Okay.
Councillor Davis?
Just a quick question. 240th and 56 and Rollison and 248th. And, they seem to have more accidents than normal. Do we go to ICBC when we look at prioritizing? Does ICBC let us know, can you, because Mayor Frost said some of the intersections have accidents more than others. So I don't know if...
I think ICBC does play a bit of a role in that they do provide grants for troublesome areas. Is that correct? We do. I have seen some small grants from ICBC.
That's correct. In addition, they do provide crash data, annual crash data on an annual basis.
Yeah, that's annual crash data. Yeah, that's okay. Because that can help set priorities too, right?
Yeah, for sure. That sounds high tech.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so move on. Just Mr. Mackin, we need to move on. So I think if we can get through the capital, then we'll look at next steps.
Sure.
Was that fair, Mr. Mackin? Yeah. Councillor Richter?
What if we've got questions about the stuff that was sent out to us last week? Where do we raise those?
Yeah, so let's get through the capital, and then we'll wrap up, and that could be a couple questions then, but we'll have to, I'm just trying to get us to the end, to 3:30, so we'll have questions at the end.
The annual sewer utility contingency, it was asked, do we need that? And if we do, why don't we have one for water? And so we provided some information on the types of projects that it's used for, and also indicated here in the second bullet that we actually do have one for water. It's just in the carry forward program. So we didn't ask for any additional money in 2020. So the carry forward will be sufficient for water. So that one is currently included within existing funding envelopes. Yorkson Community Park Development, $3.4 million. This is the one that is in need of the $1 million currently outside of funding envelopes. The balance of it is DCCs. And this is just a little bit of information from staff on that park. The question came up before that there were some questions about that park. So I'll just let it sit here for a few seconds.
Okay.
And then Milner Park parking lot is funded, is showing as funded. And what does it entail, and what if it isn't done? So it's approximately 4,100 square meters of asphalt parking and drive aisle area, which has deteriorated and requires replacement. If not replaced, operational repair costs to maintain will go up, and public safety will continue to be an issue. So I can leave that one. The arterial widening 200th Street between 66th and 68th. The question was, can staff clarify the land component? It is currently green, is inside the funding envelope, so that is currently inside the funding envelope. The project is presented for council consideration for design and construction works. The 2020 request of $500,000 is for detailed design and to determine the ultimate land dedication requirement. So investigations regarding land dedication will be required. The $2 million requests in each of 2021 and 2022 are for construction pending land acquisition. And 208 Street Corridor, 3.1 million, which is predominantly DCC funded. Can we defer the design for now and use the funding to allow Willoughby Community Hall to proceed? And I think the answer on this one was that it was, because it was DCC's, it probably wasn't an option. And long-term cycling plan?
Councillor Woodward, question. Councillor
Yeah, I
Woodward.
just want to highlight for council's consideration too that the last one, 208 Street Corridor, I want to clarify something you said. So the 1 million of that, or the 2.1, I think it was for improvements at 83rd and 84th, but there was also 1 million, if I recall, just going off of memory, for design of sections that we're not even contemplating widening at this point. So we could look at splitting that capital project into, just note that down to be more specific on flagging it, noting that we proceed with the improvements at 83rd and 84th with the community hall, but pull out the design of other sections of 208 that we're not even contemplating widening. Can you clarify that for council, please?
This is Yorkson Community Park.
This would be the 208 Street corridor regarding 83rd and
208
84th.
Street, sorry.
Yeah.
Sequencing, staff is saying the sequencing can be revised. The ultimate road section along with a median and greenway could be installed in 2020 utilizing DCC funds, reserves, and Yorkson Greenway amenity fees subject to council approving 2.1 million of the 3.1 requested.
Okay, so that confused me further because what it says here is we've got 1 million for detailed design and construction estimates for 68th to 76th Avenue. I don't see the need to authorize spending that for a section of road we're not even contemplating widening at this point, and to just reduce the cost of the project from the just focus it on the 2.1 from 83rd to 84th, and then delete these extra years. We've got 10 million next year and 10 million in 2024, so I don't think we're at. So I want to ensure that the 83rd, 84th thing goes ahead, and I'm hoping that Willoughby parking lot issues are funded as well. We can complete that section, but look at changing some of these capital projects. I just want to highlight that for council. And also bringing up the land acquisition portions of some of these other widenings. I was trying to get more information on what degree of land acquisition is in these projects that would either be funded by WRCAP or from development down the road, but not using the DCC program to buy land that's not in the DCC program. So I was looking for clarification on that, and that's where that was coming from. Okay, thanks.
Councillor Davis.
Yeah, just looking, 83rd, I should know my numbers, lived there all my life. Are we, is there land available there? What is that little road that we have to put through? 82nd? Oh, and this is buggering me up. Okay. Willoughby Hall, that road is? 83rd. Going south, there's a road there that we have to kind of make and snake around. Are we having issues with, or I guess maybe if we have issues, I guess we have another alternative plan, but is that something that, if you go from 84th that way, it doesn't go very far. And it's, you know what I'm saying? If you go a little bit more south, we need to put that, even if we don't put that road in, but we take that land and make it a two-laner because it goes from 2 lanes all the way from 88th.
So I think what you're saying is the roadway immediately south of Willoughby Hall is due to be closed at some point, and a further road, kind of with a bend, if you will go through the property to the immediate south of the road that will then be aligned with the road on the west side of 208 Street. That's all part of a development application that has been under discussion for some time. I know staff have had some preliminary discussions, but we don't know the status of that actual application here at the table. We can find that out and advise, because I believe it is probably still pre-development because of the road loss and the land values, but we can revisit that.
Yeah, okay, because we can't solve it all. And I'm not being cheeky, but if that is a piece that because of the road, and like you say, the development, if it hasn't come to the table, then that's good. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, move on. Thanks.
And this is just some information was requested on the history of the funding of the long-term cycling plan. So this is just providing that information. So I'll leave that with you. And then the question of Horn Pit was, I believe, asked and answered by Mark Becken the last meeting. The question was, how could we proceed more expeditiously? And he answered that. And then traffic calming, this is one we could consider funding from prior year surplus. As a reminder, in Councillor Woodward's plan, he has this funded already. And then the airport infrastructure demolition, again, could consider funding this from prior year surplus as well. And I believe that is the end of the capital.
Thank you. So, Mr. Backen, we've gone through 31 slides, and looking through the slides, there are a lot of information slides. So, is there further discussion we need to have before we move on to the next steps?
Your Worship, I know there's some
Mr.
questions, so it
Yep.
depends on the,
Yep.
the length of the questions,
Sure.
but I think for council to focus on, we have a couple of options, I guess, depending upon the further questions, and that is, do we wish to reconvene, to reschedule, reconvene to continue this presentation, which could be, depending on the meetings tonight, unlikely though because of the length, calling people's schedules. I think the next day we could look at is Wednesday of this week, or we can again begin to push things backwards. That's what's going to work for the group. The other alternative is, and there's some discussion to be had on this too, is can we take some of this information to the public and find what their perspective is, as has been suggested, though that too is a matter of some debate, because what would we be taking? We'll be taking all options or limited options, and I think that's something else worthy of discussion. So at this point, perhaps hear the additional questions, then we can come back and chart the additional path.
Sounds good, thanks. Councillor Long.
Well, I wasn't going to embark on a question period because we don't have time for that. I think we should probably just take it out. Can we put it out to public? 'Cause that's the way that the time frame looks to me.
Yeah. So
Otherwise, we're going to have another meeting. So
Yeah.
if we're not going to have another meeting, I think we need to take out what we've discussed and see what the public say.
is there a way to capture this so that the public can get a good view of it, and then once we hear from the public, we'll have a better sense of where they want to go?
I feel like we could, if this is okay, I'm just throwing this out there, we could put Councillor Woodward's plan up as is. It's out there now anyways. Yep. And then we could have the public comment on all the pieces of the staff plan, the individual pieces, without coming to a grand total of what that might mean.
Right, and then it gives us more information.
Yeah, then they can comment on the climate items as a whole, yeah, and the different themes.
Okay, there's several who wish to speak here. Councillor Richter.
Yeah, I'm feeling like we have just been rammed through these budget discussions today. I'm no closer to figuring out what are the projects that should be funded and what are the projects that shouldn't be funded, because we haven't had a robust enough discussion on it. I still have additional questions. I mean, this climate action thing that came around, the total of all the monies on this sheet is $4.9 million. And what is the purpose of this? Are we mailing this out to people? And
it's in its beta form right now. That was the question had come up on trying to wrap our head around what this the climate program would look like. And engineering had that in process. As you can see, it says draft on the top. So this is just trying to identify some of the things that are on the radar for.
But it says at the bottom here, the township's commitment to climate action projects, initiatives, and research requires additional funding for 2020.
Yeah, they have asked for that $1,055,000 in 2020.
Okay. The other question that I had is with regards to this operating expenditures and property tax chart, 2019 to 2018, or 2009 to 2018. And I'm not understanding this chart, but at first glance, it looks like we're spending more than we're making, like way more than we're making. And to me, this necessitates a discussion of why.
Where would you find that?
It was in the package of information that they sent. It doesn't have any numbers on it.
I don't know if I have that handy. Okay, thanks.
But it came out with the budget thing.
So this is just verbatim what was requested. The property tax revenue showing how it's trended over this period of time. The operating expenditures by themselves, but what this doesn't show is all of the other revenues, development fees, recreation revenues. It just literally gave the two items that were asked for in the flagging session that we had. So it's not trying to relate them, it's just trying to show that this is what's happened with our total operating expenditures over this period of time, and then the property taxes right below it. It's not inferring that our operating expenditures are way more than our taxes, because we actually hope that we're funding a lot of our operating expenses from sources other than taxes. So, yeah.
It's not very clear from that chart.
Okay, yeah.
Anyway, I think we do need an additional meeting. I think we need to take one more crack at this. And the average house value in Langley for this year is at 1.015.
That's the amount that came out of the 2019 process. So we always use that, the last year's representative household, and we were told that it's decreased, the average has decreased by about 5%.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Whitmarsh?
Yeah, I'm feeling a little uncomfortable sending this out to the public as is. It feels to me that there's some good ideas here, there's some creative thinking, but there's also, I think, some modifications of some of that creative thinking that would be really helpful. And I think just sending out to the public as is doesn't really provide what those modifications or different ideas could be. So to me, if it was going to go to the public, I'd like to see the proposal as it came, maybe there with 2 or 3 other modifications along the way. It feels like as a council we need to go through each of the different sections of the proposal and actually make a decision if we support that or not as a council before it goes to the public. It's a little bit of a fishing expedition if we just put this one idea out and say, hey, what do you all think of it, without providing those other alternatives to it. Even though there's many good creative ideas in there and I think there's something to work with, I just feels like we're about a month behind. It would have been nice to have this same conversation a month ago and we could really develop what we think as a council. So I'm not ready to send it to the public.
Thank you. Councillor Woodward?
Yeah, I'm going to concur with that. I think we should be sending a draft budget to the public that not on everything and here's everything budget. What do you want budget? Because I think everyone's going to want everything. That's what I want. I want everything too. But I also want a reasonable tax increase and managing and making decisions, and I think that's what we're here to do. Sure. So I would really like to see it refined, and some of these ideas that I've proposed and others have proposed either accepted or rejected, and that's the process. Yep. And I'd like to go through that and find time to do that before going to the public if possible. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Arneson?
I'm checking my calendar as we speak. So I'm optimistic we can find a time within this week time frame to get together and digest. I agree with Councillor Woodward and others that we really need to put something together that's more of a comprehensive list of what we have pre-considered on behalf of the taxpayers, then make more of a concrete determination about what we want to put forward. Because I agree, I think it would be too confusing. And at this point, I feel a bit like a sausage. I've just been stuffed into a casing. So it needs to be cooked a little bit before we get to the point where I think I've got a better sense of, on balance, all of these different things. Because the relationship of them to each other, I think, is really critical. And the other thing I do want, I know you've undertaken to some degree, but the notion that some changes will have implications over the longer term, and to make a more detailed assessment of what some of those can look like. So I'm going to use this joke I sort of came up with myself. I don't want this to be a Spanx experience where we have something that's basically a little overweight and you scrunch it down, but then when you take it off, it looks apparent that the thing, balloons up. So anyways, that's my 2 cents, but I'm hoping sometime this week we can find a convenient date to schedule yet another meeting. And thank you.
Thank you. So that's, I think it's pretty clear we want to have another meeting. So Mr. Backen, is this Wednesday, I thought you mentioned this Wednesday might be appropriate.
I'm just going historically from people's schedules,
Yeah.
and they may have changed. I thought there might be some conflicts on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so Wednesday is an option, but Tuesdays and Thursdays are also open for staff as well.
Okay. So, okay, who can't make Wednesday? I hear, okay, and is something you cannot change? It's I've got stuff I've got to dump out too if I come Wednesday.
It's a judging thing. But I could go in the afternoon if you started maybe at 2.
Can we do an afternoon meeting and then I think everybody's on board? Okay. So why don't we, okay, Councillor Rector?
I've got regional parks in the morning and parks in the evening. So
Okay.
we couldn't run into the evening on Wednesday.
Okay, so
That would be the problem.
so we had 2 o'clock, 3 hour gets 2 to 5. we should be able to do 3 hours, and it'll give us a good stab at it. We don't have the energy, it's a lot. So what, if that works, we can at least get something going on Wednesday afternoon. How's it work?
Just wondering if we could do 1 o'clock as opposed to 2.
I have to come back from Abbotsford, so I could be here late, that's okay.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so why don't we say Wednesday and afternoon, and then we'll let the clerk determine the time, and hearing everybody can talk to people. So, Councillor Woodward, do you?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate too that, that's fine if we can do it at 1:30 or 2 o'clock, preferably sooner, but we wouldn't be able to go past 6 or 7, so that would be the only limitation.
Yeah, I think I've got a meeting at 5:30. But anyways, we'll let the clerk decide that. We'll just make, so the motion here is that Council receive and refer the 2020 Universal Services operating budget to a future special budget meeting of Council for the purpose of further consideration, discussion, and approval as received or amended. So it'll be just as received, I would think.
Your Worship, that was where we were headed, but because we're in mid-meeting now,
Okay,
to
so
avoid
just
notices,
adjourn?
we could just adjourn it to,
Okay.
you set the time and date,
Sure.
so is it 1:30?
1:30? Okay, 1:30? 1:30, 1:30? Okay.
Adjournment to 1:30 tomorrow.
There we go. Wednesday. All right, there we go. Done. Seconder?
All be able to, on Wednesday, let our spank.
Yeah, well, not you. So I take it you're seconding it. All those in favor, show of hands. Opposed, carried. So the meeting's adjourned till Wednesday, 1:30. We're meeting, then we get our break since we go to closed.